The young lady sat quietly in her room while there was a thunderstorm outside the window. She didn't move when she heard a knock on the door. A moment later, Isabella entered the room with a smile and informed the young lady that it was time for a snack. She sighed heavily and told her nanny that during a war there was a shortage of food, so snacks were a luxury. Isabella said, "Madam, that you are the one and only emperor of the Eastern Empire, and she is his daughter." She said that the young princess was a role model, and she was sure that when the emperor returned, he would be pleased with her endeavors. But the princess knew that this was not so, because even if they were blood relatives, she only had the name he gave her at birth. It was the emperor who started the war when she was 6 years old. The war had been going on for several years and was not ending. The young princess looked intently out the window. A moment later, Isabella smiled and pushed forward a small piece of cake for the princess. She asked the princess not to worry, as the emperor would soon return from the battlefield. And she also told the princess not to worry, as she would protect her. The young princess sighed heavily and thanked her nanny for her support. She knew that if the magic had remained, she would have helped her father end the war. In the Eastern Empire, there was a legend that was passed down from generation to generation. Only in contrast to the true White Knight, an all-powerful witch of the White Knight appeared, who fulfilled all the wishes of people. And by some coincidence, this witch was she. The day when the full moon rose, someone sincerely made a wish. At that very hour, the witch of the White Knight fulfilled it, as it is said, in a new legend. Many people came to her with their best wishes. She listened carefully to everyone, because she was strong in the conclusions she had made. But for some reason, when she opened her eyes again, she saw a small bed. She lost her power, also lost her mother, and became the only daughter of a tyrant emperor. She was reborn and became a princess. The emperor, in turn, looked at his daughter with fury, since his beloved wife died because of her fault. He abandoned his daughter, still an infant, alone in a huge palace. She never saw her father's face in her entire life. Only Isabella cared for her with all sincerity. She was not about her and the person who truly loved the princess. Isabella looked at the lady with a gentle smile and told the lady that it was raining heavily outside today. She looked closely at the princess and said that in such weather she should be careful, as she could catch a cold. Alicia looked at her nanny intently, but said nothing. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the window, where a serious thunderstorm was breaking out. She froze for a moment when she heard a crash outside the window. A moment later, Isabella screamed, frightened by the lightning. The young lady, in turn, looked out the window in bewilderment. She was a little excited because she felt something, so she suddenly shuddered. Isabella walked up to the window with lightning speed and began to close it. She smiled and asked the princess when the war would end. A moment later, the princess sighed heavily and said that most likely the war would end soon. A few seconds later, they heard some kind of rumble. A moment later, a knight burst into their room and hurriedly called the princess. Isabella was in shock. She did not understand what happened and asked the knight how he could just burst into the princess's chambers. But the young knight in turn shouted that the emperor had died on the battlefield. Isabella froze in shock, as she did not expect this, but the young princess maintained her composure at that moment. She sighed heavily, as she had been left an orphan at her young age, but her lost magic returned in that same hour. The knight bowed and said that fortunately they had won the war, but in the final battle, the emperor had been defeated. The princess did not listen to the young knight and asked what his name was. He looked at her in surprise, introduced himself a moment later, and said that he was Chauvel. Isab. The princess came up to the young man with lightning speed and said that she had missed one thing. He looked at her in bewilderment. Alicia looked at the knight and said that, whatever the case, entering the chambers of a royal person without knocking was extremely rude. She looked at him intently and said coldly that such was the law of the empire. The knight was taken aback and froze in place. He was shocked and wondered if the princess had ever been like this before. He quickly asked the princess for forgiveness. She, leaving, said that it was all because she was a princess, imprisoned in a palace. But that did not give him a reason to ignore the law. A moment later, she walked out of the room, but her nanny froze in shock, as she had not expected such a thing. After some time, a smile spread across her face, as she knew that the emperor had died and there were no other candidates for the throne except her. Isabella ran after her mistress in a hurry, not knowing where she was going. The young princess wondered if she should take the place of the emperor. Sometime later, the meeting of the ministers of the empire began. The men were shocked by everything that was happening, and so they wanted to find the emperor's relatives in order to put one of them on the throne. They knew that if they looked at the collateral branch of the imperial family, they would find someone. They cried out because they were puzzled, because they knew that when the emperor ascended the throne, he killed all his relatives. But a moment later, there was a loud explosion, and the doors to the hall flew apart with a roar. Unfortunately, the people who were next to the door also followed behind the door, all frozen in shock, as they did not understand what was happening at all. A moment later, the princess entered the hall and asked with a smirk why they were beating around the bush. Everyone was shocked by what they saw. Everyone present looked closely through the veil of smoke and saw the princess standing there. She, in turn, looked at them with a grin and said that she was a contender for the throne. The men were shocked and did not understand who she was to sit on the imperial throne. But the young princess did not take their words seriously. A moment later, the man shouted to everyone else to look at the color of her hair, as it was the same color as the emperor's. They were shocked because they saw her scarlet eyes, which the emperor had. They couldn't believe that in front of them now was a real princess. She asked with a smirk if they had only just realized this. She asked with a smirk if they had any problems. The man was furious and did not understand where it was possible to see a princess as an emperor, since he knew that she had been imprisoned in the palace all her life. He did not understand how a princess who never left the palace could become an emperor. She asked with cold fury what family he was from. The man froze for a moment from her cold gaze. She looked at him intently and asked his name. They were shocked because they knew she was too young, but they saw great potential in her. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was the Marquis de Marais of the Perhan family. The princess looked at him with a fierce grin and said that the level of ministers leading the country was very low. They were taken aback and wondered if it was really the emperor himself who was behind the princess. The princess said with a grin that it seemed like they needed an emperor who was like a puppet. The marquis was shocked and shouted that everything was not like that at all. She looked at them all intently as she realized that they were trembling in front of the child. Duke Arnold Herdev greeted the princess. The duke said that the only thing they were worried about was the ability of the imperial family. The duke said that the position of emperor required great effort and ability, and it was difficult to appoint a princess as emperor when there was no evidence of her ability. He also said that many regions were destroyed due to the war, and they should resolve this issue right now. He looked at her intently and asked if she could prove her worth as an emperor. The young princess said with a grin that it was very easy to do. After a few seconds, she used her magic. At that very moment, the duke began to float in the air. He was stunned and screaming, but she said that he would see everything with his own eyes and tell about everything that happened. The ministers were shocked by what was happening. They did not know if it was possible to teleport so quickly. They understood that there had been no magicians like her before. They knew that the emperor had also reached the level of a sword master at around the same age. For some time, they continued to whisper among themselves, but at the same time, Isabella trembled and looked at the place where the princess had been a few minutes ago. The young princess went with her companion to a suburban city in the Eastern Empire. After some time, she landed on the ground with her light force, but the duke fell with a crash. She was nervous, as this was her first experience using magic in many years. But everything went like clockwork. She believed that she had lost the entire sum of the orgy when she was reborn, and did not understand when she returned. She told the duke that she had moved them to the nearest town to the border. The princess saw that the city was very badly damaged, and the duke asked her in bewilderment what she intended to do. She sighed heavily and told the duke to just stand and watch. She slowly picked up a handful of earth, and after a few seconds, she used her magic. She understood that now, with just one wish, all their traumas would be healed, and the destroyed houses will be restored one after another. She knew that there would be plenty of food in the houses so that people could eat their fill and not get sick. Alicia looked at the renewed city with a gentle smile after she restored it. The residents were surprised, and at the same time happy that the city was completely restored, as were they. The duke at the same time was stunned by what he saw. He could not believe what had happened. But a moment later, the young princess disappeared along with her companion. Unexpectedly, just as she had appeared, everyone thought that a goddess was coming towards them from below. After some time, they returned to the castle, Everyone pounced on them, as they wanted to know where they had been. Alicia, with a satisfied smile, told everyone present that all the work to restore the border zone had been completed. The ministers were shocked because they knew that the war had ended only yesterday, and she had already managed to rebuild the city. The man looked at the Duke intently and asked if the princess's words were true. The Duke, in turn, was stunned and said that it was all true, and all the work in the border region was completed in an instant. He looked closely at all his comrades and said that the princess just waved her hand and restored everything. She turned around and walked away with a smile, knowing that they shouldn't make a fuss over such a small thing. But a moment later, she was taken aback and stopped as she saw her nanny, who was standing in the same place. Alicia looked at the men hard and said she wouldn't ask them to confess, but they weren't to think she'd forgiven them. As she left, she told them with a smirk that they should just wait for her to surprise them. A moment later, the young princess was walking to her room with her nanny. Alicia looked closely at her nanny, as she could tell she looked surprised. But she saw that the nanny did not tell her anything about what had happened. 9 years ago, Destiny gave birth to a young princess in the midst of universal blessings. But the death of her mother, as well as the contempt of her father, changed her destiny. It all started with the anger of the imperial people. But young Isabella wondered what sin could have been committed by such a small life. She didn't want the young princess to remain alone all her life, so she decided to dedicate her life to her and become her family. Isabella believed that she knew the princess better than anyone else. She had been shocked by her look some time ago. She understood that when she looked at the princess, she saw a completely unfamiliar person, so she doubted that this was her princess. But at that very second, the young princess took her nanny by the hand and looked at her with a smile. Alicia asked the nanny with a smile if she was really that surprised by what happened. Isabella did not answer, but only called her mistress. The young princess looked at her in surprise. Isabella looked in my direction and said with a smile that the weather was very nice today. Isabella understood that it didn't matter at all who the princess was. She intended to live next to her always, and for this the princess thanked her. From that day on, everyone bowed their heads before the young princess, and the princess's abandoned palace was soon put in order. But the young princess did not stop gaining knowledge after everything that happened, because she started taking classes on succession for imperial persons. Due to the lack of education from early childhood, she had to quickly make up for lost time. She needed to get acquainted with all the sciences, but for an ordinary child, such a pace would be an unbearable burden. But for her, everything was in the order of things. She studied tirelessly, but suddenly she heard someone knocking on her door. Moments later, she saw Sadelt, imperial advisor. He came to the title at the age of 17. Being the right hand of the emperor, he served the family for 7 whole years. She looked closely at the young man, for she knew that the tyrant emperor had not beheaded him, which meant that his value was great. The young man greeted the princess according to all the rules of etiquette. She also greeted him coldly in return. Sadelt said that he had carried out her orders, and the news of the emperor's death had not yet left the palace walls. She knew that in the current turbulent situation, it was better to keep such a thing to herself, so she said with a smile that the fewer people knew, the better. Sadelt was in shock, as he knew that the funeral had also been postponed as long as possible. She looked at the young man intently and asked if Devian had already arrived at the palace. He said that the young man was already waiting for her. A moment later, the young man entered the princess's office and greeted her with a smile. She looked at him in surprise and asked since when he started showing up on time. He was shocked. He didn't understand how she could say something like that. Devian said with a smile that he was always devoted to their activities. A moment later, he handed her a magic scroll, on which was drawn a magic circle that even the best scholars and magicians of the tower could not decipher. She looked closely at the scroll in question, but a moment later, the princess looked at him and asked if he was making fun of her. She asked in surprise if he had really decided to teach her this. She knew that every time he hoped for her answer. Devian said with a smile that he would like to have the answer to this riddle, but a moment later, he saw her burn the scroll. He was shocked and couldn't believe what he saw. Devian smiled and said that luckily he was familiar with her character and had saved a copy so she could see how serious he was about their studies. Alicia sighed heavily and said that he had to give her the scroll. A moment later, he watched her write her reply, his eyes fixed on her hopefully. He looked at the young princess and said that the emperor was one of the few sword masters in the world. He looked at her intently and said that the news of his death would cause a storm of emotions, as he had heard that the king of another country had used black magic. He said that during the battle between the emperor and the enemy king, a huge black wave fell on the emperor. Thus, this wave caused a powerful explosion. The princess asked in surprise what happened next. He said that after the explosion, the emperor disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing behind. Davian said that a search party was sent out, but he was never found, so the emperor was declared killed in action. Isabella smiled and wished the young princess sweet dreams and left. Alicia pretended to be asleep for a while, but after a few minutes she got up. She looked closely at the documents that lay on her desk. She felt very sorry for her nanny, but she knew that since she had made it clear to everyone that she would become emperor, she had to give it her all. The young princess looked closely at the documents. She knew that children were being kidnapped in the empire right now. Alicia, in turn, was puzzled, as it seemed to her that there was something suspicious about this case. She looked into the distance with a grin, as she knew that now was the time for a child to walk through the streets of the village. After some time, she visited the village. The young princess looked into the distance as she saw empty streets, but she knew she had to use magic to find the children. A moment later, she used her magic and began to comb through the village. Her magic spread for many miles, and after a few minutes, she found the house where the children were. She cast her magic a little lower and noticed the men who were guarding the dungeon. But after a few minutes, she went down even lower and noticed the children themselves in the damp dungeon. The young princess was very happy, as her search was crowned with success. After some time, she visited the dungeon where the children were. The boy looked at the young lady in surprise and wondered if it was really an angel in front of him now. She looked at him intently and gestured for him to be quiet. She smiled and said that she would definitely save them, but they had to behave quietly. After a few seconds, she looked back. The princess was a little surprised because your report only listed 6 missing children, but there were more. A moment later, she used her magic and thereby opened all the doors of the dungeons. She looked closely at the children and wondered if they had decided to turn the children into slaves. She was furious, but then she noticed how the young guards came running at the noise. They were alarmed because they did not understand why the cages were open. But a moment later, they were taken aback as they noticed that the girl had made her way towards them. Alicia looked at them with cold fury and used her magic. A few seconds later, the young men were bound in magical chains, and they fell to their knees on the ground with a crash. Alicia turned around and looked at the children, saying that they were free and asking if they were going to go home. She looked at all the freed children in surprise, as she didn't understand what was wrong with them. Looking at the young savior, they said that they did not know the way home. She sighed heavily because she knew that she still had work to do. A moment later, my princess used her magic and transported everyone outside. Alicia looked closely at the freed children and said that if they followed the arrow, then everyone would find their home. They said goodbye to their savior with a joyful smile, and the princess, in turn, wished them a good journey. She knew the forest was small, but she wondered why the villagers had never been able to find the children. The next day, everyone was discussing the situation, as they were surprised that the princess had solved the problem of the series of child abductions. They knew that the kidnappers were locked in the dungeon, and unfortunately, they remained silent. But an interrogation was underway. The Marquis told the ministers that the princess had dealt with a major problem of the empire. The Duke said that since the war, there had been chaos in the country, and the princess had solved all the problems, and that was a lot of work. The Marquis said he agreed. There was no longer any reason for her to demand that she prove her qualifications. Everyone looked at each other intently. They knew that it was time for a new sun to rise in the empire. At the same time, the criminal sat in a cell, wrapped in the princess's magical chain. Alicia looked at the man closely and asked if they all wanted to tell her the truth. She asked if they were involved with illegal slave dealers. The young man said he didn't understand what she was talking about now. The princess looked at him with cold fury and said that she was asking you for the last time because she would find out the truth anyway. The men froze in place in shock as they were enveloped in her cold gaze and anger. The young man said that, unfortunately, they could not tell the truth, because if they revealed the information, then death awaited me, and much worse. He told the princess that she had nothing to change, but how cruel that woman was. After his words, he coughed terribly and fell to the ground. The young princess looked at the young people with a grin, because she knew that this was all funny. Sometime later, the young princess was walking around the city. She looked around intently at the inhabitants, who were going about their business. She knew that now it was better for her to change her childish appearance to that of a grown-up lady. A moment later, she was walking through the city in a different guise. She looked closely at the nondescript building. Knowing that it housed a casino, Alicia judged from the kidnapper's memories and realized that an auction for the sale of slaves was being held in the dungeon under the casino. She was puzzled and did not know what they were hiding from the eyes of the Empire, but she knew that if she found that woman, she would be able to solve the riddle. But a moment later, she ran into my young man. He asked for forgiveness and quickly left. Alicia froze in place for a moment as she felt black magic. She looked closely at the young man, as she thought the black energy was coming from him. She sighed heavily, as she realized that this was none of her business at all, since she needed to deal with something else first. A moment later, she approached the casino where magical artifacts were being tested. She was surprised and did not understand what they could do with such a pathetic test. She knew that they could not surpass her. After a short check, she was allowed inside. Alicia walked inside slowly and looked around as she noticed the gambling tables. A moment later, she turned her gaze to the young people. The young man smiled and said that he had bought a golden ticket to participate in the auction, and that he had spent a lot of money in the process. A few seconds later, she used her magic and made herself a golden pass. She approached the young man and asked if she could ask him for help. He looked at her in surprise, but still agreed and began to slowly check the ticket. Alicia looked at the young man and said that the auction was about to start. She asked if he would not let her in. He was taken aback and said that was not the case. A moment later, the young man led the princess to the entrance. A few seconds later, she entered the hall where the auction was to take place. She looked around carefully as she realized where the underground auction would take place. Alicia looked into the distance with a grin, knowing that this was a very interesting place. Alicia knew that before the auction began, she had to go and look at everything. She slowly used her magic, making herself invisible to everyone else. She entered the employee hall and noticed a young man carrying some merchandise. She understood that he was carrying an expensive thing, which could be purchased from a master. But a moment later, she looked closely at some goods, for she saw that they contained imperial things. But after a few seconds, she heard a female voice. The girl was addressing the Baron. The young lady looked at the Baron intently and said that those who were supposed to bring the children had fallen into the hands of the imperial palace. She said that she thought that after the end of the war, the imperial army had been replenished. So today her brother would bring something worthwhile. Alicia, in turn, looked closely at the young lady as she noticed her luxurious red hair. She wondered if the woman was behind everything. The Baron looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what her brother did, as he was constantly supplying them with expensive things every month. She smiled and said that she could not reveal this information. He sighed and said that the main thing they needed was to receive the goods. Sometime later, the young lady got her a small bottle of liquid. She looked closely at the bottle and realized that in front of her was a drug that only a black magician could make. Kashanabulith, a rare thing among men, the blackest magic consumed life and soul. Therefore, it was forbidden by the will of the gods. Alicia understood that the drug could only be prepared by someone who was a high-level black mage. She was furious because they had done a much bigger job than she had previously thought. A moment later, she stared. The auction began. The young lady looked at all the guests with a smile and thanked them for coming to the auction. She smiled and introduced herself as the organizer of the auction, and her name was Kira. She began the auction with a smile and presented the God-blessed ruby brooch. Alicia was surprised as she noticed that the jewel given was from the kingdom of Loret. The ruby brooch is a national treasure of the kingdom and was the 12th heart of the world. She knew that although the country was small, it was still an official state, and they were now putting the country's assets up for auction. A few seconds later, the bidding began, and everyone present was placing bets with excitement. Alicia watched everyone closely as they placed their bets. A moment later, she sighed heavily, knowing it was time for her to begin her performance. A few seconds later, the lights in the hall went out, and everyone was taken aback, as they did not understand what was happening at all. Kira, worried, asked everyone for forgiveness, as they had some problems. She said that they would fix everything soon, so she asked the guests to remain calm. But a moment later, they were all taken aback as a bright light shone. Alicia took the brooch with lightning speed, knowing that it was a national treasure. The young lady looked at the girl with fury and asked who she was. The princess, in turn, looked at the girl with a grin. A moment later, she used her magic and the brooch disappeared from her hands with lightning speed. The princess said that she was a member of the Imperial Family Council and had come to catch illegal traitors. Everyone was taken aback. They didn't want anyone to catch them, so they ran away in a hurry, and the princess, in turn, said with a grin that they wouldn't be able to escape. She quickly used her magic and sealed the doors. Everyone present was taken aback and froze for a moment. Alicia looked at the girl with fury and asked how she dared to hold illegal auctions on the lands of the Empire. Kira looked intently at the uninvited guest, but did not answer. The Baron was furious. He shouted that she was trying to pass herself off as a person from the Imperial Palace in order to disrupt the auction, since she was young. He quickly walked up to her and snatched the paper she had given them. He was furious and didn't understand where she came from. He shouted that he knew that the Emperor was dead. She looked at him with fury and asked if he had really dared to make such statements in front of the future of the Empire. He froze for a moment. Even though he was a baron from a poor family, he knew that only members of the imperial family had silver hair. The Baron froze as he walked away when he saw the silver hair of the young lady. A moment later, he fell to the ground with a thud. "I don't know what to do." Alicia looked at them with a grin and said that there was still someone left in the imperial palace who could put the seal. Kira looked at the young lady with cold fury, but said nothing. Alicia, in turn, looked at them with a fierce grin, since she had won. Sometime later, the young princess became indignant. Back to the castle. She froze for a moment when she heard her nanny's voice. Isabella quickly rushed to her mistress and, with tears in her eyes, asked where the princess was. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had been away for a while she had raided an illegal trade. Isabella looked at her mistress with alarm and called her. The princess was in shock, did not understand what was happening, and asked her nanny who had offended her. Isabella sighed heavily and said that she had been serving one man for many years, and her unaccompanied expeditions worried her. Isabella said that it would be very good if she warned her about her expeditions, and also told her about her location. The princess sighed heavily and said that from now on she would tell her everything. Isabella smiled brightly at her mistress and said that it seemed to be a promise made by the princess. The next day, Sedelt greeted the princess. She asked why he was looking for her. The young man said that the ministers were waiting for her in the conference room. She was surprised, as she did not expect this. Sedelt said they conveyed that they had something important to tell her. She assumed it would be about her coronation. She said that she had been showing them her ability and skills lately. She looked at the young man and called him. He shuddered. The princess looked at him intently and asked if he was faithful to her. She knew that until now he had been restless in carrying out her orders, but she could not say with certainty that he was devoted to her. She knew that he was the emperor's man and loyal to the crown. The princess sighed heavily and said that she would immediately understand whether he was telling the truth or a lie. Sedelt knelt before the princess and said that he could do only one thing for the peace and well-being of the empire, and that was to serve the son of the empire. She looked at him intently, because she knew that he would not disappoint her, so that was enough for her. Alicia told the young man that one of the palace servants had recently received good money for information he had given about what was happening in the palace. Sedelt sighed heavily and said that it was his fault, but the princess didn't think so. She said she had caught him, and he was now in prison, so the young man had to find out who he was paying for the information. She smiled and said that they were finished with that, and now she could go to the ministers who were waiting for her. At the same time, there was complete chaos in the conference hall, but a moment later the ministers fell silent. They saw the princess. According to the rules of etiquette, everyone greeted the princess. Alicia, in turn, simply walked past them. She sat on the throne and looked casually at everyone present and asked them to get down to business. The duke bowed to the young princess and asked her to become their son and dispel the darkness of the empire. They looked at her intently and, bowing, asked her to become their emperor. Alicia looked at everyone present and a moment later called the Minister of Finance. The man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she wanted from him. Alicia looked at the man intently and said that it was time for them to begin preparing for the coronation. Some time later, Isabella was preparing her mistress for bed. Alicia looked closely at her nanny. Isabella smiled and asked the princess if she was very tired. Alicia knew that the emperor had imprisoned her, and then everyone turned away from her. but the only person remained next to her, protecting her. She looked closely at her nanny and called her. Isabella smiled and asked the princess what she wanted to say. Alicia sighed heavily and told her nanny that she would soon become emperor. In a place that was no different from a birdcage, only Isabella cared for the young lady. Isabella looked at her intently, but with a gentle smile, she told her mistress that she would always be by her side. Isabella looked at the princess with a tender smile and said that she would follow her wherever she went. Alicia thanked her nanny with a tender smile. Knowing that she was her only family, Isabella told her mistress that if anyone betrayed the will of Her Majesty, she would be the first to maim him and cut off his head. Alicia looked at her faithful nanny with a joyful smile. Isabella looked closely at her mistress and informed her that she was already ready to go out. The young lady looked at her nanny and said that it was time for them to begin. Isabella looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that she was the most beautiful in the world. Alicia smiled and asked if this was true. Isabella noticed the change on her mistress's face and asked if she was really uncomfortable in her outfit. Alicia smiled and said that she was truly happy now. Isabella smiled a joyful smile and told her mistress that she too had been happy in serving her. Alicia looked closely at her nanny as she was glad for her support. But a moment later, Isabella informed her mistress that she was ready. Alicia sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to begin. She knew that after 9 terrible years, she would finally come out into the world. A moment later, everyone present greeted the young princess. She looked at everyone intently, as she knew that she would soon receive the crown. She saw how everyone who attended him bowed to her. She knew that after so many years, she would be seen as an empress, not a princess. Alicia was clearly aware that right now she would become the new son of the empire. A moment later, the priest began to hand over the crown to the new emperor. But after a few seconds, they heard a loud roar. Everyone was shocked as they saw the door explode. The ministers fled in all directions as the walls collapsed. The young princess, in turn, used magic to protect herself and the priest, who held the crown tightly. She knew it was a magical wave, and not everyone was capable of something like that. A moment later, the emperor entered the hall and said angrily that in his absence, some fearless little thing had wanted to take his place. He looked at his daughter with cold fury. He looked at her closely and said that Anna had a rather interesting face. The ministers were frozen in shock as they could not believe that the emperor was alive. In a hurry, everyone began to shout and call for the emperor. The priest, in turn, was puzzled because he did not know what to do. The young princess was puzzled because she only wanted to become the new son of the empire, but her plan came to naught. Alicia asked her father for forgiveness with a grin, as she had never seen his face, and therefore did not know if it was him. The emperor was shocked. She greeted him with a smile. She bowed and introduced herself, but he walked past her and told her to get lost. Alicia sighed heavily and told her father that he had a truly nasty character. A moment later, the emperor threw the crown to the ground. She looked at her father, puzzled, and asked if she had said that out loud. The emperor turned around with lightning speed and looked at her with fury. But at the same time, he put his sword to her throat, because she dared to insult the emperor. She said with a grin that the empire was now, unfortunately, in complete chaos, and being a princess, she could not stay away. He said with fury that he saw that even death did not frighten her, and it seemed that she was a complete fool. Alicia said with a smile that he was very funny. She pushed his sword away and said that if the truth were to be told, he had already decapitated her with that ball. She looked intently at everyone present and said that her father was tired from the long journey. Alicia asked with a smirk, "How about Togo passing the throne to the younger generation and retiring?" The emperor looked closely at his daughter and said that it seemed she really did want to be beheaded. She bowed and said with a smile that if this was what her father wanted, she could not resist such a thing. She said that she would leave today, but would return tomorrow. He looked at her with fury and told her that she had to get out of his sight. Sometime later, the young lady was in her bed, thinking about everything that had happened. She understood that her magical power was destroyed in front of the emperor. She remembered how he mercilessly put the sword to her throat. Then she wanted to use her power, but nothing happened. She was furious and didn't understand what had happened. A moment later, Isabella walked up to her mistress and asked if she was okay. Alicia looked at her in confusion and asked why she shouldn't be okay. Isabella sighed heavily and said that the princess was probably upset about what happened. The princess smiled tenderly and said that she was fine. Isabella looked at her mistress with a tender smile. But a moment later, she asked the princess if she would like to hear a funny story. She said that she had heard the story when she was young, and it was about the White Knight's witch. Alicia was puzzled because she was the White Witch. The White Knight's witch lived on the moon. They said that if you sincerely make a wish, she will fulfill it. Isabella looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and said that the beta was not worried. Isabella said that she would continue to pray to the White Witch for the princess, and she would help her. Alicia looked at her nanny with a gentle smile on her face, and at the same time, she thanked her for her support. At the same time, someone was praying tirelessly and asking for the wish to be fulfilled. The young princess woke up the next day, but she was puzzled as she had had some strange dream. She was a little worried, as she felt uneasy and awkward at the same time. In the morning, the young princess was carefully thinking about her dream. She felt as if she remembered something, but did not know what exactly. Isabella offered her mistress a small snack. But a moment later, she saw that the princess was worried about something, and so she asked what was wrong. She asked the princess if she had had a nightmare last night. The princess knew that now was not the time to worry about such trifles. She called her nanny, Isabella, with a joyful smile, asked the lady what had happened. Alicia smiled into the night with one smile and suggested to her nanny to go for a walk. Sometime later, they went into town for a walk. Isabella was struck by teleportation magic, but she heard that when someone used teleportation magic, it caused dizziness. The princess said that this only happened to beginners. Isabella was worried, because she did not know what to do, since she did not take any money with her. A moment later, the young princess showed her nanny a whole bag of money. Alicia looked closely at her nanny, and with a joyful smile told her not to worry, because she had taken care of the poor thing in advance. Isabella was very surprised, because she did not know where her mistress got the bag of money. Alicia smiled and said that she got them as her work from the imperial treasury, but in reality, she just stole the money from the vault. Alicia looked closely at her nanny and said that she must have suffered, living alone in the palace, without receiving a penny. She smiled and suggested that they go shopping today and have some fun. Isabella looked at her mistress with a tender smile, but a moment later, she happily agreed with the lady, and they went off to have fun. A moment later, they entered a clothing store. The young princess showed her sign with lightning speed. The young ladies were shocked as they immediately understood who was in front of them. In a hurry, they shouted that they would be taken to the best room immediately. Isabella asked the princess if one of the palace staff had given her the badge. The princess smiled and said that the badge with the emblem of the imperial family was on her father's armor. Isabella was shocked, as the prince unsettled something like that. But in turn, no one gave her anything. She just stole the badge. A moment later, they were having fun, as they were offered various decorations and outfits. Young ladies with joy prizes, realities, various outfits, Princess said. Girls, so that you send a check to the imperial palace. At the same time, in the imperial palace, the young man reported all the events to his master. The emperor was shocked because some of the gold coins from the vault had disappeared, and the badge with the emblem of the imperial family had disappeared. The emperor was burning with rage as he received a huge bill. Sedelt bowed and said that everything was correct. The emperor realized that his daughter had broken through several barriers in the vault. He wondered if she had stolen gold through a gap in the barrier. Sedelt looked closely at the emperor, awaiting his verdict. A moment later, the knight entered the emperor's office and announced that he had come with a report. He said that the princess wanted to invite him to tea, but the emperor quickly declined. Isabella looked at the emperor intently and said that the princess would be very upset. Sedelt sighed heavily and called the emperor. But when he looked at the place where the emperor was, he saw no one. At the same time, the emperor stood on a small lawn. He gazed intently at the lake, which shone with its beauty. Princess Soy asked the emperor with a smile if the weather was fine today. He stood frozen in place for a moment, without saying a word. Meanwhile, she quietly sipped her tea. She smiled and told her father that since he had refused to have tea, he could join her for the picnic. A moment later, the emperor slowly sat down next to his daughter and looked at her intently. He looked at his daughter with cold fury and asked what she was doing. Alicia sighed heavily and said that she thought His Majesty did not like sitting on the ground. A moment later, she easily used her magic and pulled the blanket over herself. A few seconds later, they were already sitting at the table. She asked him with a smirk if he was comfortable now, but at the same time, she held him with her magic. He sighed heavily and coldly asked why she didn't leave now. Alicia looked at him with a smirk and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that since she had such abilities, she should understand that the attitude towards her would change. She smiled and asked where to go. And if her home was here, he looked at her with cold fury and asked if she thought he might kill her. She smiled and said that they really did have a pretty funny speech. Alicia asked with a smile if he was saying that because he thought it was possible. She looked at the Emperor intently and said that she was not going to stay here to save her life, and she did not want to receive the love of an irresponsible father. She sighed heavily and said with sad eyes that she was already tired of living as if she were dead. A moment later, she told the Emperor that she was tired of living alone and seeing the palace day after day. The Emperor, in turn, looked at her coldly and said that she should just live as she had lived before. Alicia asked if there was something he didn't like. The princess said that she had never imagined that the empire was filled with such interesting things, and now that she was here, she did not want to leave at all. He looked at her with cold fury and said that she infuriated him. Alicia said, with a smirk, that he needed to make a choice before saying that. A moment later, she used her magic and the Emperor disappeared. This irritated her greatly, since she could not control her magical power near the Emperor. She sighed heavily, since she knew that he should have killed her back then, since now she planned to exclude changes. The next day, the Emperor gathered all the ministers for an audience. He was informed that for several years of war, they had not yet held a banquet in honor of a debut, and they could not put it off any longer, because there were young men and women who were now 16 years old, and they had not debuted. Debut is one of the most important events in the empire, at which young men and women first entered society. Usually, the debut event was held at the age of 16. But the Eastern Empire was unable to hold a debut for the children of nobles for several years due to the length of the war. The ministers told the Emperor that at this celebration, they needed to inform the aristocrats about the existence of the young princess. The young man froze for a moment, knowing that the war had long since ended, but he still felt the cold emanating from the Emperor. The Emperor thought for a moment about the princess's debut. Everyone looked at the Emperor intently, waiting for his answer. Sedelt, in turn, looked intently at the Emperor because he did not know what he would say. But a moment later, the Emperor sighed heavily and said that they should still arrange a debut for the princess. At the same time, the young princess and her nanny were sitting in the garden and drinking tea. The princess was surprised because she did not expect to make her debut. Isabella smiled and said that she heard that the debut would be in a few weeks. Alicia looked at her nanny and asked if she could choose not to participate. Isabella was shocked. She told the princess that she must definitely attend the banquet, since it also deducted the victories of the empire, and she had never seen a debutante ball, and therefore she must be there. Isabella quietly told the princess that she heard the Emperor himself gave the go-ahead for the princess's debut. Alicia was a little surprised as she didn't expect her father to do something like that. The princess sighed heavily and said that she should still take part in it. Isabella was alarmed and wondered if the Emperor was going too far. Alicia looked at her nanny in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Isabella said in a puzzled tone that they had a lot to prepare for the debut. She understood that the Emperor might have informed them earlier about the princess's first debut. The young lady was confused. She did not know what to prepare first. She wondered what she should do. First of all, prepare a banquet or an outfit. A moment later, she looked at her mistress and said that she had no training in dancing. The young princess was surprised, as she had not expected to have to dance. Alicia looked at her nanny and asked if she could just cheat. Isabella looked at her mistress with a gentle smile, as she did not know where to start. Since the young princess is set to debut in a few weeks, they have sped up the schedule. They selected accessories and outfits. After this, there was basic training in etiquette. Next came dance lessons, which took place every day. The young princess was furious, as she could simply die of fatigue, and so she wondered if this was what the Emperor wanted. The Countess smiled and told the princess that she should concentrate her attention on dancing. A moment later, the young princess obeyed and began to dance with her nanny. The Countess smiled and said that she was worried about the accelerated schedule, but the princess exceeded her expectations. Isabella smiled and said that the princess could do anything. The Countess looked closely at the young princess and asked if she had already decided on a partner, and for her debut, The princess thought about the question for a moment. She knew that everything was correct and that the aristocrat's partner was his father or one of his relatives. A moment later, she said that her partner would be the emperor. The ladies froze in place for a moment. Sometime later, the young princess was resting in her bed. She sighed heavily as she knew that she had said the first thing that came to her mind. But she was clearly aware of the fact that the emperor would never become her partner. She sighed heavily, knowing that she shouldn't even hope for something like that. A moment later, everything swam before her eyes. She sighed heavily and slowly pulled the blanket up. She didn't understand why she needed to learn to dance when she didn't even have a partner. The young princess was a little upset by this fact, but she knew that it was just a waste of time. At the same time, someone was asking the White Knight's witch very much to help give birth to a child. The young lady said that she really wanted the child to be born and to look like his father. She asked the White Knight witch to give her permission to meet her child. Alicia was shocked because she didn't understand who else prayed to the White Knight witch. The young lady said that she really wanted her husband to feel love, not only for her, but also for their child. She wanted to have a happy family and wanted her child to be happy. The White Knight's witch told the woman that she would fulfill her wish because she was an all-powerful witch. The young princess, in turn, closed her eyes tightly as the bright sun was shining in her eyes. But a moment later, she woke up and sighed heavily as she had the same dream again. But, unfortunately, she did not remember it. She slowly walked up to the window. Alicia stared at her reflection. She sighed heavily because she didn't think she had slept forever. She didn't understand why her cheeks were burning. But a moment later, she turned around because she heard some kind of crash. She looked in surprise at her nanny, who had just dropped a basin of water. Slovenia, after Isabella rushed to her mistress and hugged her tightly. Isabella couldn't bear it any longer and burst into tears. Alicia was in shock. She didn't understand what had happened while she was sleeping. Isabella looked at her mistress intently and informed her that she had slept for 10 whole days. The young princess was shocked. She did not expect anything like this. She looked at her nanny in confusion and asked if she had really slept soundly for the past 10 days. She was shocked because she knew that it didn't matter now because she was about to make her debut. Isabella looked closely at the princess and said that she had previously thought she was terminally ill. Alicia said with a smile that it seemed she had woken up successfully. Isabella was in shock. She kept telling her mistress that her health was more important than any score. She looked closely at the young princess and asked if she was sure she was okay. The princess looked at her nanny with a smile and said that of course she was fine, and she was now sitting quietly and eating. A moment later, they turned around because they heard some noise. In turn, she looked away and saw a young man who was running towards her at full speed. Devian ran towards the young princess with a happy smile. She was confused because she didn't understand what happened and why he was running towards her at full speed with a happy smile on his face. Sometime later, the princess and her companion were sitting and drinking tea. She sighed heavily and asked why he had come unannounced. Devian, with tears in his eyes, told the princess that she had been sleeping all this time. He said that he simply could not help but visit her. She smiled and asked if he had really come when he found out that she had woken up. Devian looked at the princess with a gentle smile and called her. Devian asked the princess with a joyful smile if she wanted to visit the magic tower. The young princess, in turn, immediately replied that she did not intend to do so. He froze in shock because he did not understand why she did not want to. She sighed heavily, and as she left, she said that he would again ask her to solve all sorts of magic circles. She said that she did not want to, and her decision was immutable. Devian looked at her confidently and asked if she wasn't curious. She looked at him in surprise, as she didn't understand what he was even talking about. Devian, he smiled and asked if she wasn't interested in seeing her subjects who were researching magic for the Empire. He looked intently at the young princess and coaxed her. She sighed heavily and said that there was a ball in a few days, and so she was busy. He said that she did not need to say anything, and she could visit the magic tower for just a few minutes. He smiled and said that she could pretend that she was just going for a walk to get a change of scenery, and she could also look at the magic circles, if that was what she wanted, of course. The princess looked at the young man with a smile and extended her hand to him, as she agreed with his proposal. A moment later, he took her hand and she used her magic. A few minutes later, the young princess found herself in the magic tower of the Eastern Empire. The young man froze in place from shock and surprise. His friend almost fell down the stairs when he saw the princess. They looked at the princess in surprise, as they did not expect her to see him in his magic tower. With lightning speed, they surrounded the young princess, for it was a great honor for them, and they could not believe that she had come to them herself. With lightning speed, they surrounded Devian, as he managed to persuade the princess to visit the magic tower. Devian smiled and said that this was not entirely true, as she decided to visit them herself. They chatted pleasantly for a while. Alicia looked intently at the young people. They looked at the young man with burning eyes and asked if the princess would really decipher the magic formulas. He sighed heavily and said that this was not so, because she refused, and at the same time he asked for forgiveness. The young people were stunned by what they heard, as they had hoped that she would help them. Devian looked at the princess with a smile and said that he would now take her and show her everything in the magic tower. A moment later, they walked deeper into the magic tower. Devian sighed heavily and with a smile asked for forgiveness from the princess, instead of the young people, since they were immersed in research all day long, so they were a little inadequate. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that he said such things as if he thought he was different. He was shocked and asked if that was not true. A moment later, the young man sighed heavily, because he knew that there was no point in trying to prove anything to her. He said that if she went higher, she would be able to see a beautiful landscape. A moment later, they entered a small room, and she froze for a moment as she saw that there were many interesting things in there. He smiled and said that it was. He pointed to a small stand with a smile, as there were magic circles everywhere. Devian pointed to the teleportation circles. Alicia looked closely at the small scrolls. She knew that because of the complex teleportation formulas, they had to be stored in this form so as not to lose them. She raised, now why were the super technologies needed? She noticed that there were a lot of them, and now she understood why the young man behaved like a peacock. But a moment later, the young princess pointed out a small scroll to the young man, as she noticed that he was the most suspicious of all. Devian informed the princess that this circle of magic connected to the dragon's nest. Devian smiled and said that because of the wide range of magic they had to store it here. She sighed heavily and asked if anyone used it. The young man smiled and told the princess that he had heard that once someone entered the dragon's lair, they would never return, so they did not try to use it. She thought for a moment, for she knew that the dragon was asleep, and he was also petrified. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she didn't mean anything like that, and also said that it was useless, so she didn't understand why it was kept so carefully. He looked at her intently and said that the creator of this scroll had a reason. A moment later, he looked at the young man and said that he was the one who created this scroll. Raven sighed heavily, not paying attention to anyone. The princess looked at the young man in surprise and asked why he had created this scroll. Raven yawned, said it is being used in an ongoing study. Devian looked at the young man intently, but did not answer. A moment later, he noticed his cloak, as it was all dirty, and therefore asked what had happened to it. The young man sighed heavily and casually said that he probably got dirty when he fell, and nothing bad happened, because it was just the juice of the bonbrew berries. Devian froze in shock, but a moment later, he hurriedly asked his friend if that juice wasn't super sticky. Raven asked his comrade what he was talking about. A moment later, he realized his mistake, as the scroll in question was stuck to his sleeve. Devian was shocked, because he didn't understand why his friend took the scroll in the first place. But a moment later, the young man cried out in fury that the scroll had got to him, since he could not detach it from himself, and he carelessly tore it. The young people were shocked because they realized what the wizard had done. A moment later, everyone was transported to the dragon's lair. They were in shock and wanted to go back. The young people were puzzled because they did not understand who touched the list at all. But a moment later, they realized who had messed up, so they wanted to deal with him quickly. The young princess, in turn, looked closely at the young people. A moment later, she sighed heavily and turned around. The young people looked at the princess in surprise, as they did not understand where she was going. She sighed heavily and said that it was time for her to go back. Alicia looked at the young people with a smirk and said that they should quickly get up and explore after her. The young people looked at the princess in bewilderment. She smiled and told them that she would get them out of this place alive. They looked at the young princess with joy, because they knew that she would do everything possible to help them. A moment later, they were climbing the stairs. The young princess, in turn, overcame all obstacles with lightning speed, but she asked the young people to be a little more careful. Alicia informed them all that the tower was full of different traps, and they should just follow her tracks. They happily agreed to follow her plan. Before her rebirth, she had been to the tower several times. She knew that in order to get out of this place, they had to go through the gate left by the dragon. She knew that if he were alive, they could come to an agreement with him. Devian called the princess with a joyful smile and said that he was very fast. She sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that, but she did not expect such a thing from him. He looked at her intently and said that it seemed to him, it seemed so, but he still asked if this place was familiar to her. She sighed heavily and casually said that it only seemed so to him. He looked at her with disbelief and said that she was not surprised, and it seemed to him that she had been here before, although he knew that it was quite difficult to surprise her. As he spoke, the young princess watched him closely. She realized that he had fallen into a trap and suddenly pulled him to the side. The young man was in shock. He froze in place, not understanding what had happened for a moment. Then he looked away and noticed an arrow in the wall. Alicia didn't bother to explain to him what had happened at all, and a moment later hurried upstairs. He shouted that since she knew, she could have warned him. She sighed heavily and asked what good it would do if she warned him if he dodged like a turtle. A moment later, they came to the gate where the dragon's nest was located. The young people froze in place from the terrible sight. A moment later, the princess told her companions to step back immediately. She wondered if it would work this time. A moment later, she clearly saw an inscription on the dragon statue, which said not to show fear of the dragon. She read this inscription, and at that very second, the walls began to shake. The young people were shocked and frightened by everything that was happening. But the princess stood still. She knew perfectly well that this hall would not collapse, but she saw that the statue was ready to spew fire. Alicia knew that they had to withstand the blow, and then they would be able to get out. The young people were in shock and did not know what to do. She looked around and noticed that everyone was shaking in fear. And at that very moment, the princess realized that the only one who could withstand the dragon's onslaught was she. A moment later, the dragon struck at the unexpected travelers. Devian immediately grabbed the young princess and rushed to the side with her. Alicia was surprised, as she did not expect anything like this. A moment later, they fell to the ground with a crash. She was in shock, did not understand what had happened and why he had pulled her. But the young man was furious. He did not understand what she had done. He shouted and asked why she stood there and did not dodge the blow. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He screamed that her fire almost turned her into ashes. He looked her over hastily, as if he wanted to know if she was okay and if she was hurt anywhere. He sighed heavily and asked why she did this, because they were all worried about her, asking the young princess if she really wanted his heart to stop that very minute. Devian sighed heavily and asked the princess not to do that again, as he was very worried, and so he asked her to take care of her precious life. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she understood that she should have stood her ground and they would have just quickly returned home. She did not understand why he was so angry. After a while, she sighed heavily and asked him if he wanted to let her go, since she really was fine. At the same time, Isabella looked at the princess in bewilderment and asked where she had disappeared to. Isabella ran up to the princess in a hurry and asked if she was hurt. The princess smiled and said that she was fine and that she had simply overdone it in her game with the young man. She looked closely at her companion and asked if it was true. Devian was taken aback and looked at the princess in bewilderment. Since she was not hurt, there was just a dragon there. He did not finish speaking when suddenly the princess hit him and furiously told him not to say a word about the dragon. With tears in his eyes, he sighed heavily and said that he brought her to the very top of the magic tower. Isabella looked at the young men with bewilderment and said that she would go and get some water at once, as they both looked simply awful. A moment later, she ran away in a hurry and asked them to wait a little, as she would be back soon. Devian sighed heavily and brushed the dust off the young princess. She looked at him intently and called out, A moment later, the princess asked the young man if he would go with her to the debutante ball. Devian stood frozen in surprise for a moment and was speechless. But after a few seconds, he extended his hand to her, and with a joyful smile, said that it was a great honor for him. He asked if she would dance her first dance with him. She looked at him with a joyful smile and agreed. But a moment later, he looked at her excitedly and asked if she was sure of her choice. The young princess looked at him in bewilderment and asked why not. Devian sighed and, looking away from the young lady, said that this was her first debutante ball, and she wanted to go to the ball with him. She sighed heavily and asked if he was afraid that as her partner, he would fall under the wrath of the emperor. He sighed heavily and said that he wasn't afraid of it at all. She just needed to know it by now. He said that the magicians from the magic tower were considered eccentrics, while they were all without title and status, and they were respected only by looking at their faces, and behind their backs they were despised and condemned. He sighed heavily and said sincerely that he was very worried that her reputation might suffer because of him. The young princess sighed heavily, but did not answer. She was a little sad, but at the same time happy, because even her father did not worry about her. She extended her hand to her companion, and with a soft smile, said that she was already nicknamed the Locked Princess, so he did not need to worry about her rumors and reputation. She looked at him closely and said that he was the one she chose. The young man was speechless for a moment, but after a few seconds, he gave her his radiant smile, as he was very happy. After a short silence, he smiled and said that, unfortunately, he was bad at dancing, and so asked if she was now sure of her choice. She looked at him intently and said that they were going to the ballroom right now. Sometime later, the day of the debutante's ball arrived, and the young princess actively participated in the preparations. The maids looked at the young princess with glowing eyes as she was shining with beauty. They said with admiration that she looked like a doll. Sometime later, the young people stood near the carriage, waiting for the princess. Isabella froze in place with admiration when she saw the young princess. She looked at the princess with shining eyes and said that she was beautiful. Devian looked at the princess with a joyful smile and said that she was truly a beauty. She looked at them with embarrassment, but did not answer. A moment later, Princess Isabella asked her nanny how she managed to find the carriage, because she didn't think that her father had given the go-ahead for something like that. And she smiled funny and said that she had put in a lot of effort. Of course, she was aware of the fact that teleportation was a cool thing, but today she had to shine the best. Devian extended his hand to the young princess and said that it was time for them to go. The young princess looked back and thanked her nanny for her help, and also said that she was already leaving. Sometime later, they arrived at the castle. The young man bowed and greeted the princess, and also told her where she needed to go. They followed all their instructions slowly, and they passed by people who were whispering, because they had heard that the princess had been locked up for many years, but they knew that she was the only daughter of the emperor, and they knew that the emperor had not yet recovered from the death of the Empres, and they assumed that he was thinking about a new heir. A moment later, the princess stopped as she saw her father. She smiled and greeted the emperor, who, in turn, looked at his daughter with cold fury. The emperor froze when he saw her. The young princess stared into his eyes, showing no emotion. He froze for a moment as memories of his late wife came flooding back. She looked at the emperor with a smirk and said that she thought he would not participate in this event, and she also said that he did not tell her about it. He didn't answer her, and a moment later they entered the banquet hall. Alicia sighed heavily and, looking at everyone present, told the emperor that she was almost left without a partner, being the only princess of the empire, but she had her scientist. She looked away with a smile towards her partner and said that it was very lucky that he was next to her. The emperor did not answer her, and a moment later, without looking back at his daughter, he left her. She sighed heavily and looked intently after him. Devian, in turn, looked at the princess with sadness and longing, because he knew that she was in pain. But a moment later, he looked at the princess with a smile and said that he had not thought at all that he would meet the emperor so soon, so he was very nervous when he saw him. He looked at the young princess with a smile and said that they should dance. With the speed of lightning, her face changed, and she looked at him with a gentle smile and also agreed. After some time, they came out to the center of the hall. She smiled and asked her companion if he could do all the movements they had worked on. Devian was taken aback and hastily said that he would do everything, since he did not want to let her down. Alicia looked at her companion with a tender smile, and a moment later they began to dance. Before they could start dancing, they heard an incredible roar in the hall. Everyone present was in shock, and they scattered in different directions. Alicia was in shock and didn't understand what it was. A moment later, the knights got ready and took out their balls. As they knew that there was an invasion, they shouted to all the guests to evacuate quickly. But a moment later, everyone noticed how the killers flew through the windows, and the glass shards flew in different directions. The aristocrats were in shock and ran in different directions. The young princess shouted to her companion to take the guests away immediately. He shouted that he would do everything possible, and also asked her to be careful. A moment later, he followed her order and began to quickly lead everyone out. Alicia looked around, covering her mouth from the dust. But a moment later, she noticed a young girl hiding behind a column, trembling with fear. She quickly approached the girl and asked what she was doing now, as she had to save herself quickly. The young lady grabbed the young princess's hand as she helped her to rise. The princess was furious and shouted at the girl to hurry up, or she didn't want to die. The young lady quickly came to her senses after the princess's words, and, with tears in her eyes, shouted that she would try to run away as quickly as possible. A moment later, they were running vigorously out of the hall as a haze of dust enveloped them. But after a few seconds, Alicia turned around because she saw the killer approaching them. With lightning speed, she used her magic. But after a few seconds, she realized that she had failed. Her magic was not working. Deviant flinched and froze in place when he saw that the princess was unable to use magic. He was shocked because he noticed that a killer was rushing towards the princess. He screamed and reached out to her. Some time ago, the young knight was momentarily taken aback by what he saw. He was shocked because he didn't know where the emperor and princess were. But when he entered the hall, he saw that an assassin was heading towards the princess. With lightning speed, he dealt with the murderer, and in the process, blood gushed over the princess. He hurriedly approached the princess and asked excitedly if she was okay. But after a few seconds, he froze in place in shock. He was puzzled because he saw that the blood splashes were right in front of her, and the corpse was lying at her feet. But she did not even flinch. He understood that this was not at all typical for a child. At the same time, the princess looked around and realized that the killer was behind the column. She was in shock and did not understand why she had not been able to use her magic. A moment later, she looked at the knight and called him. He was taken aback, as he was stunned by her calm appearance. She, unperturbed, asked him to give her his sword. He was surprised, as he did not expect such a thing. But a moment later, he obeyed and gave her his sword. She slowly pulled his sword and thereby cut the entire carpet. Unfortunately, Alicia knew that her magic was unstable. This greatly irritated her, since this had not happened in the past. But she knew that since magic was disobedient, she should not despair, because she just had to believe, and everything would work out for her. She thrust the sword into the floor with a loud bang, and with all her strength, and at the same time her power activated. Her power spread throughout the hall. In doing so, she was able to freeze the killers, and they froze in place, rooted to the spot. Chevelle froze in place, not from her magic, but from shock, as he did not expect to see anything like this. She looked at everyone present intently, as she knew that everything was fine, and she could handle everything. With ease, the young princess pulled the sword out of the floor and swung it. A moment later, she was dragging the sword back to the knight, but in doing so, she managed to use her magic and enveloped the assassins in her magic and trapped them in chains. She sighed heavily and casually wiped the blood from her cheek. She wondered what had just happened to her companion. A moment later, she looked into the distance and noticed that her companion was lying on the ground, while all the other guests were under the dome. Alicia was shocked because she did not expect anything like this in such a hurry. She shouted and called the young man, but received no answer. Some time later, the young man was carried into a spacious living room, and the princess was next to him. She was puzzled, as she knew that even the emperor had tucked his tail between his legs and avoided it. She looked closely at the young man, as she knew that he had continued to save people and was now in serious condition. After some time, the young princess used her magic on the young man. She noticed that he had already gotten much better after she had used magic. After a while, she sighed heavily and sat down on a chair. She knew that the palace was in complete chaos, but she did not understand what the emperor had been so busy with all this time. A moment later, her young princess heard a knock at the door and gave her permission for us to enter. Sedelt rushed into the living room in a hurry and called out to the princess in fear. He sighed heavily and began talking about the emperor, but the young princess's face showed that she simply didn't care about the emperor right now. But still, a moment later, the young princess was in the room next to the emperor. Looking at her father, she felt the presence of black magic. She didn't understand where he picked it up, but from the rumors, she knew that he barely survived the attack of black magic. Now she assumed that his condition had worsened. A moment later, the young princess coldly said that the emperor was very exhausted. The doctor hurriedly asked the princess when the emperor would wake up. Alicia, in turn, looked at the man with cold fury, and he shuddered. The man was taken aback and, trembling with fear, said that they needed to wait because His Majesty was too weak after the war to recover in time. She looked at the man with cold fury and asked if he couldn't accurately determine his awakening. The man was very frightened, and in a hurry, he fell on his knees and shouted that he would do everything possible to help the emperor. Sedelt approached the young princess because he wanted to tell her something. He said quietly that Madame Kira had escaped from the dungeon. The young princess was surprised by this news. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that the young lady had escaped during the commotion. Sedelt bowed and said that he knew perfectly well that it was inappropriate now, but he still had to tell her. He said that if the emperor did not recover, then she would have to deal with the chaos of the empire. She sighed heavily and calmly said that she did not want to do this. They looked at her in bewilderment, as they did not expect such a thing. She sighed heavily and asked with a smile, "What if her dad woke up and decided that she was aiming for his throne?" Alicia looked sideways at everyone present and said that she would not sign up for this again. She sighed heavily and looked closely at the young man, as she saw the bruises under his eyes. She knew that he had been sorting out the work for many years while the emperor was playing at war. Alicia sighed heavily and asked if they had determined where the explosion had come from. Sedelt said that they had figured everything out, and the blast line and the invasion were connected to the underground dungeon. She looked at him intently and asked if that meant that the people who infiltrated the palace were Kira's allies. Sedelt said they thought so, and that's why they started investigating her case. The young princess was a little puzzled as they broke through the knights of the palace and entered the banquet hall, and nothing caused the slightest concern. A moment later, she changed her face and said with a grin that it would turn out that a rat was wandering around the palace. She looked at the young man intently and said that they needed to find all the rats, as well as the missing prisoners and Kira, among others. They tried to find traces of Kira, starting from the casino, but her tracks were carefully scattered, making it difficult to track. Alicia sighed heavily, as she was already very tired of everything. She had no idea who Kira really was, but she was acutely aware of the fact that there was more than one person involved in this matter. She wondered if she would have to deal with this too. She sighed heavily, for she knew that if the emperor came to his senses and could not find something to do with himself, it would be very bad for her. But she knew that this was not the main problem now, and what was more important to her now was her strength. She was well aware of the fact that she needed to immediately find out the reason for the failure of her power. Time the maid looked after the emperor. They looked in bewilderment at the door, which quietly opened. They were shocked when they saw the princess, but she still told them to be quiet. Alicia slowly walked up to her father, who was still sleeping peacefully. She noticed that her strength was uncontrollable next to the emperor. She was confused as her power was getting out of control. The maids looked at the young princess with tears in their eyes, as she was irresistible, because she still wanted the emperor to wake up as soon as possible. Even though he could lock her in the palace, he was still her father. She sighed heavily, as she knew that it was still not easy to find the emperor's weak spot. But she knew that her magic and the emperor were somehow connected. A moment later, she winced as she saw that her father had come to his senses. With lightning speed, she turned around and walked towards the exit. The maid looked at the young princess in surprise, as she did not expect that the attack would quickly leave the room. But after a few seconds, they saw that the emperor had woken up. He glanced sideways at the open door, as he realized that his daughter had come to see him. After the emperor's awakening, Sedelt came to the emperor to report to him everything that had happened. He looked intently at the emperor and said that he would like to say something in addition to the report. The explosion that happened on the day of the debutantes is now being investigated by the princess herself. He sighed heavily and said that the criminals who escaped from the dungeon were found and imprisoned in the dungeon, but unfortunately, they were still unable to find Madame Kira. Even her whereabouts were unknown to them. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it seemed that there was a rat in the imperial palace. Sedelt bowed and said that she had finished his report. He looked closely at the emperor, for at such moments, they were as alike as two peas. He remembered how the princess had also told him that a rat had appeared in the imperial palace. The emperor looked closely at his assistant and told him to continue the investigation as instructed by the princess. Sedelt bowed and obeyed the emperor's command. At the same time, in a dark alley, young people noticed a young lady. Kira looked at the young people with a satisfied smile and walked past them. They looked at her intently, but she said with a predatory grin that the conquest of the Eastern Empire was just around the corner. The next day, the young lady opened the letter because she was invited to tea. Isabella, sir, told the princess with a happy smile that tea party sounded very nice. Alicia thought for a moment, as she did not know the young lady named Elizabeth Herdeb, but a moment later she remembered the Duke. Isabella looked at her mistress intently and said with a smile that she knew who it was. She looked at the young princess intently and said that she had heard that the Duke had a daughter about the age of the young princess. Alicia thought for a moment, as she had not heard anything like that. Isabella beamed with joy, for she knew that this was very good, because after the debutante's ball, the princess was invited to another drink, and there she could find a friend. The young princess sighed heavily and looked intently at her nanny. She asked if she really thought so. A moment later, she told her nurse to tell her that she was going to tea. Isabella beamed with joy, for she knew that her mistress would soon have a new friend. A moment later, she looked at the princess in bewilderment as she saw the worried expression on her face. Alicia looked at her nanny with a happy smile and asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Isabella smiled and said that it was a very good idea. A moment later, they came out into a beautiful garden, and Isabella admired its beauty. Alicia smiled and said that they should pay attention to the roses that were grown in the imperial palace. Isabella looked at her mistress with excitement and asked what would happen if they suddenly ran into the emperor. Alicia looked at her nanny in bewilderment and asked if she was really afraid of the emperor, but she did not need to wait for an answer, so she saw that her nanny was trembling. Isabella quietly approached the lady and asked how one could not be afraid of the emperor. She knew that all he could do was look at them like a wild cat. The princess smiled and said that everything would be fine. She smiled and said that if they suddenly stumbled upon him, then they would greet him and move on. A moment later, the princess told her nanny that she could tell her something interesting. Isabella looked at her mistress in surprise, since she did not know what they would talk about. Alicia asked the nanny if she knew that there were teleportation circles hidden in the garden. Isabella looked at the princess in surprise, as this was the first time she had heard about it. The princess in turn smiled as she saw one of the circles. She knew that this circle was established by her father. She looked at her nanny with a smile and asked if she wanted to come closer and take a look. Isabella was alarmed and said that she did not want to do this, because since it was the emperor's own doing, they should not go there. The young princess let go of her nanny's hand and told her to go and look around the garden, and then return to the room. Alicia smiled and told her nanny that she would take a little walk in the garden. Isabella was shocked because she did not expect this. She was alarmed, looked after her mistress and called her, but she did not answer, and she shouted to the princess to be careful. A moment later, the young princess was leisurely strolling through the garden. She looked closely at every circle that came her way. She was surprised. She did not understand who came up with the idea of such aesthetics. She noticed that everything was done quite interestingly, since the path was laid in the form of a pattern. But a moment later, she came across a small greenhouse. A few seconds later, she was transported to another place. She froze for a moment as she saw the emperor sitting quietly under a tree. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand who was dozing at such a time in such a place. She didn't understand how he could just sleep peacefully in a place like that, even if a spell had been cast there. She noticed that he hadn't fully recovered yet. Alicia looked at her father intently. She saw that from any angle his face looked stern. A moment later, the young princess sat down next to her father and slowly removed the petal from his face. He woke up and looked at his daughter in bewilderment, but she only smiled in response and said that today was a beautiful day. He was shocked and so asked how she got to this place. Alicia smiled and said that it wasn't that hard. He looked at her with cold fury and with lightning speed rose up, and also asked who she really was. Alicia looked at him in bewilderment and said that she didn't understand what he was talking about. He shouted angrily and said that she must not pretend, because until she told him who she was, he would not let her go. Alicia sighed heavily and asked what about him. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what the question was about. She sighed heavily and asked who he thought he was. The emperor looked at his daughter with cold fury and anger and shouted at her not to dare play word games with him, for he needed to know whether she was truly the emperor's flesh and blood, or just a hidden shell. Alicia looked at the emperor intently and asked what if she really was an empty hidden shell with the title of princess. The princess said that during the attack on the palace, in the moment of chaos in the palace, she protected the people who remained in that hall. She looked at him with cold fury and asked where he was at that time. Alicia looked at her father with cold fury and said that an emperor who could not properly protect the people was not worthy of being called an emperor. She screamed that instead of her father, who could not take care of himself, she had been cleaning up all the chaos since that day. She asked with fury if this was her reward. She looked at him intently and said that if he was so upset, he could explain why he ran away. A moment later, the young princess bowed to her father and said that it seemed that their conversation had reached an impasse, and so she had no choice but to leave. After a few seconds, she used her magic and disappeared, leaving the emperor alone. He thought for a moment, and memories of that day came flooding back to him. Then he saw the assassin staring at the princess, preparing to strike. The emperor prepared himself, as he wanted to deal with the assassin. But before he could take a single step, he froze in place as he was enveloped in black magic. He coughed up blood and immediately fell to the ground, becoming increasingly enveloped in black magic. He was furious as he felt a barrier of black magic, and his eyes closed, but he still looked at his daughter. He sighed heavily as he was powerless to change what had happened. Some time later, the young princess went to have tea with her friend. The young lady bowed and sincerely thanked the princess for coming to the tea party. Alicia looked at the young lady in surprise, as she recognized her, but she still asked if the young lady was really the same one from the debutante ball. Elizabeth happily grabbed the young princess by the hand and said that everything was right, and she was very grateful that the princess had saved her that day, and so she wanted to express her gratitude to her. Elizabeth said she was scared that day, but when she saw the princess fighting the criminals, she gained courage. She knew very well that the young princess did everything to protect the citizens of the empire. The young lady looked at her benefactress with admiration, for she knew that she had probably been just as frightened that day. Alicia looked at the young lady with bewilderment and confusion, as she did not understand what was being discussed, but she still admitted that she was a little scared. Elizabeth looked at the young princess with delight and asked how she managed to learn such magic. The young princess sighed heavily and was puzzled, saying that she hadn't really taught her that much. The young lady was surprised and amazed, as she thought that the princess had been studying all this time. The princess looked away from her companion and said that it was simply experience and instinct that helped her in this matter. Elizabeth was surprised because she did not know that such a thing could happen. But a moment later, the young lady asked the princess how much powerful magic she possessed. The princess looked at her companion with a grin and said that it seemed really interesting. She asked if the young lady wanted to see what she could do. A moment later, the young princess used her magic, and Elizabeth froze in delight. Elizabeth was shocked and thought it was all a dream as they were transported to the sea. Alicia said with a smile that they shouldn't stand still. They could just have fun. Moments later, they were transported to a small town that was near the sea. They happily walked around every shop with various goods. The young lady had a fun and joyful time. A moment later, they came to a small shop where there were many interesting things. Elizabeth noticed that in the shop, there were souvenirs that symbolized the Witch of the White Nights. Madame smiled and told the girls that they were good at it. She smiled and said that they had many dream catchers that were made in honor of the White Night Witch. She smiled and said that they said that if you hang one in your room and make a wish, it will come true. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at several dream catchers. She knew that the souvenirs, the witches of the White Nights, were in front of her, and therefore she felt somehow uneasy. The madame smiled and asked the girls if they liked the legends about the White Night Witch. The princess sighed heavily and said that she would not have said that. But Elizabeth said with delight that she adored the White Night Witch and still made a wish. Elizabeth looked at the princess with a smile and said that she would hang this souvenir above her bed and make a wish, as she wanted to grow up and become stronger. The princess looked closely at her new friend, as she enjoyed spending time with her. She was glad that her friend liked the White Night Witch. Some time later, they passed through a crowd of people. Alicia knew they had to be careful not to get separated in the crowd. She wanted to use the teleporter so she wouldn't get lost. But a moment later, she looked back and noticed that her friend was not next to her. She was shocked because she did not understand when her friend could disappear. At the same time, a young lady sat in one of the alleys and quietly cried. She did not know what to do if she could not return home. But a moment later, she flinched as she heard someone's voice. She was surprised, looked at the old grandmother, and asked if he had just called her. The old woman smiled and said that it was so. Because the young lady was very beautiful, she asked the girl to come closer to her. Elizabeth looked at the old woman in bewilderment, not understanding what she wanted from her. A moment later, the old woman pulled a mirror out of her pocket and told the girl to look into it. She looked at the young girl with a smirk and asked if it didn't suit such a cute girl. At the same time, Elizabeth looked at the mirror as if it was frozen. A moment later, her gaze dimmed and she said, as if enchanted, that it really did suit her in the mirror. The old woman said with a grin that she would sell the mirror for just a few silver coins. But a moment later, the princess snatched the mirror from the old woman's hands and smashed it. The old woman was in shock because she did not understand what the girl had just done. But a moment later, the young princess used her magic, and the old woman froze for a moment. Alicia looked at the old granny with a smirk and said that this was a very dirty trick on her part. Some time later, the young lady was sitting in a cafe. Elizabeth was quietly crying, as she thought that she would never see her parents again. The young princess looked closely at her friend and said with a smile that everything was already over. She didn't need to worry. A moment later, she began feeding her friend with the sweet dessert. Elizabeth looked at the young princess and thanked her. She said that she was now in her immediate debt. The princess smiled and said that she should not worry about such things. But in turn, the princess was a little wary of this situation. She looked at the old woman with cold fury and said that she forgave her for her dirty tricks, but she must not make her repeat them. The old woman was taken aback, as if she had woken up from a long sleep. A moment later, the old woman turned around and ran towards the exit with lightning speed. She screamed that she knew nothing at all. The princess was confused because she didn't know how many black magicians there were in the empire. She looked around carefully and wondered if there had always been so many of them among the common people. She sat quietly and thought about the situation. But a moment later, Elizabeth smiled and handed her a small cookie, asking the princess to try the dessert, as it was very tasty. Alicia thanked her friend with a smile and also tried the dessert, but in turn, she was immersed in her thoughts, as she knew that she needed to start the investigation as soon as possible. Late in the evening, the servants ran in a hurry to the young lady. They were very scared and worried, because they didn't know where she was, and they had been looking for her for a long time. Elizabeth looked at the butler closely and said with a smile that she was fine. She asked if he had told her father about this. The butler hesitated, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, the Duke came out to them and greeted the princess. The Duke, according to all the rules of etiquette, greeted the princess, bowing, and the rest of the servants followed his example. Alicia looked at the Duke and said with a smile that they had only gone out for a short walk and that they should not worry so much. Elizabeth smiled and said that she and the princess had been by the sea and that it had been really wonderful. The Duke was taken aback and looked at the princess in surprise. Alicia smiled and said that the young lady had told her that she had never been to the sea. So they decided to take a walk. She said that since they had returned safe and sound, he should not scold too much. The Duke sighed heavily, as it was an awkward moment for him. But he still smiled and said that it was a great honor for him. Elizabeth bowed with a smile and told the princess that today was truly a fun day. The princess bowed back and told her friend that she hoped they would meet again. As she left, she turned around and looked intently at the father and daughter. She saw how Elizabeth enjoyed every moment spent with her father. She saw that the Duke smiled a soft smile at his daughter. She turned around sadly, and she felt a little sad. But she knew that it didn't matter, because her only family was this or Isabella. She understood that she shouldn't be sad about something like this, but a moment later she froze in place because she remembered the words of one person who prayed to the White Witch and said that she wanted him to love like her. She said that she wanted the child to grow up in love. The young man looked at the princess with concern and asked if she was okay. She sighed heavily, but a moment later said that she was fine. The young man looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked if he had just said that the princess's torso had magic. The man bowed and said that it was true. He said with a smirk that the emperor had ignored her existence for many years. The man said that it was true, and she had just recently left the princess palace. He said with a smirk that it seemed like the emperor had been holding the golden caterpillar, but also pushing it away because of personal feelings. He knew that the emperor was really stupid. Cadell thanked the man for the valuable information and told him he could go. A moment later, he jumped out of his chair as he saw his sister, Caraceri Risentrise, Princess of the Kingdom, and also the elder sister of the king. He said with a happy smile that it was very good that she was okay. She smiled and told her brother that thanks to the knights he sent, she managed to disappear. But she still regretted that the emperor still survived during the war, but they did not come empty-handed. She smiled and asked if he received her report. Cadell sighed heavily and said that of course he had received everything, and the report spoke of the terrible relationship between the emperor and the princess. And besides that, he learned that the emperor was quite vulnerable to black magic. He knew that it was time for them to expand the domain of the Black Magic Kingdom. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that this was very good news because the emperor was very stupid. Although they did not know how strong the princess was, but 100 deaths of his wife, he pushed away his own child. The princess said with a satisfied grin that this was only to their advantage, and it would be good if they could disrupt the relationship between the princess and the emperor. Cadell said with a satisfied grin that in that case they would be able to conquer the Eastern Empire and make her one with the kingdom. The princess said with a grin that there had been nothing so funny for a long time, and she was now in anticipation. He looked at her with a grin because he agreed with her. Some time later, the young princess fell down on the sofa with a bang, as she was very bored. She asked her nanny if she would like to go for a walk. Isabella looked at her mistress in surprise, because she had only recently gone to the sea. She looked at her mistress with a smile and asked why she didn't read for the rest of the day. The young princess sighed heavily, as she didn't want to do that. But a moment later, she was already sitting down to read her books. After reading for a short time, an idea came to her mind. In a hurry, the young princess called her nanny. Isabella looked at the princess in surprise and asked what happened. Alicia looked at her nanny with a satisfied smile and suggested that she go fishing. The princess, with a gentle smile, told her nanny that they could go fishing. She spent several minutes persuading her. Isabella was a little surprised, but a moment later she said that it was a terribly strange hobby. She asked if the young lady really wanted to catch such a horror, because it was very dangerous. The young princess was shocked, because the nanny refused her for the first time. Isabella said that there were more delicious dishes in the imperial palace than kraken. Alicia sighed heavily and turned around sadly. Isabella was worried because she was worried that something would happen to the young princess. She said that the kraken could eat her. Alicia smiled and said that if that was the case, then she could go alone. Isabella was shocked when she saw the young princess use magic. The young princess looked at her nanny with a joyful smile and said goodbye to her. She also said that she would be back soon. Sometime later, she arrived at a small lake. After some time, she used her magic. Alicia managed to wake up the scary monster. She looked at the monster with a grin because she didn't know where to start in the hunt for the kraken. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw the lake become agitated. She was shocked because she saw the huge tentacles of the kraken. She looked at the monster with a grin as he crawled out on his own. She was glad because she didn't have to persuade him and realized that it was very convenient. She looked at the monster with a fierce grin as she understood that if she tied up its tentacles, the fishing would quickly come to an end. Alicia looked at the monster with a fierce grin and used her magic on it. Within minutes, he was completely engulfed in her magic and at her mercy. She pulled him towards her, but the kraken looked at the young lady with fury, as she had disturbed his sleep. She looked at him in surprise, still not understanding what was wrong with him, but a moment later, she easily walked closer to him. She was shocked because she did not understand who dared to poison an entire lake. She was furious because she knew that someone had most likely poisoned the lake on purpose. Alicia turned around and was taken aback for a moment as she saw a little boy sitting quietly under a tree. In turn, the boy looked at the beautiful lady with no less surprise. She was surprised. She didn't understand where he came from. She wondered if he came for the kraken. But the young princess in turn breathed a sigh of relief, as she knew that the kraken's poison had not reached him. A moment later, she landed easily next to the boy. He looked at her in bewilderment. She used her magic and threw a kraken onto the shore, which was completely in her power. The boy froze in shock on the spot. She looked at him intently and said that he could take it. The princess said she didn't need it. She knew perfectly well that she couldn't bring her nanny a poisoned kraken. The boy quickly stood up and bowed, thanking her because she had saved him. Alicia looked at the boy closely and said that he should not go near the lake again. As she left, she looked at him intently and said that no one knew how many more creatures might come out of the lake. In turn, the boy froze for a moment in place, as he was surprised by the appearance of the young lady, but still agreed to her demand. At the same time, Isabella was walking nervously around the room, as she was very worried about the young princess. A moment later, she looked up as she saw the princess's magic, and a few seconds later, she saw her princess falling. With the speed of lightning, she grabbed the young princess, who fell with ease right into her arms. Isabella's face quickly changed, and she looked menacingly at the princess, as she had previously made a promise to her. She looked sullenly at the princess and asked if she had really forgotten about him. Alicia looked away from the nanny and said that she did tell her where she was going, and besides, she was not aware that she was strong and could not be wounded. She sighed heavily and said that the kraken seemed so she had to throw it back into the lake. Isabella looked at her mistress and said that no matter how strong she was, next time she must take her with her wherever she went. She was very worried that something might happen to the princess while she was away. Alicia looked at her nanny with a tender smile and said that she agreed, and in the future, wherever she went, she would take her nanny with her. She smiled and asked where they should go next time. But a moment later, a young man intervened in their conversation. He bowed and apologized for interrupting their conversation, but in turn, he offered Lake Rena, which was located in the kingdom of Riventris, for their next walk. Alicia looked at the young man warily, as she had not seen him before. She looked at him in surprise and asked about the lake. He said that this lake is quite large and has beautiful blue water. The transparent water of the lake attracted all the aristocrats to visit it. The princess looked at the young man intently, pondering his words. He bowed, waiting for her answer. A moment later, she smiled and said that it was a great idea and they would go there. The young man, in turn, changed his face and looked at the princess with a gentle smile. After some time, they visited the lake. He looked into the distance with a joyful smile, as it was the first time he saw a lake, and the first time he saw a person who teleported so quickly to another place. She smiled and said that this was just a basic level. Moments later, the young princess looked into the distance with a grin, as she noticed that there was something enticing there. Isabella looked at the young princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess looked at her nanny with a gentle smile and said that there was nothing special there. A moment later, her young princess started fishing. She smiled and said that fishing was great fun. Isabella looked at her mistress with a happy smile and said that she was incredible. The young man looked at the princess with admiration and said that she was simply amazing. She looked at him sideways, but did not answer. He smiled and said that he had heard before that she was called a genius and that she could do anything, and it seemed to be true. The young princess smiled and said that it was so and she could do anything. He said with a smile that it was a great honor for him to be next to a genius. She looked into the distance with a smile and thanked him, because she was so pleased to hear something like that she even wanted to die. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she could walk on water. The young princess sighed heavily and said that it was easy. Isabella asked the princess in surprise if she was so incredible that she could walk on water. The princess sighed heavily and said that it was nothing, and that she simply had to walk on water as if on land. He looked closely at the young princess and enthusiastically asked her to show him how she could walk on water. Isabella asked the young man in bewilderment if it was safe. Alicia looked at the young man with a smirk on her face as he insisted that she walk around the lake. He smiled and said that he really wanted to see it. A moment later, the young lady obeyed his whim and walked leisurely across the water with ease and grace. She turned with a smile and, looking at the young man, asked if he was impressed by what he saw. Isabella looked at her mistress with admiration and said that she was very cool. A moment later, the young man looked at them intently and asked if they knew. Isabella looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The princess, in turn, looked at the young man warily and sullenly in bewilderment. A moment later, he said that it was customary in the kingdom to set up magical traps. At that very second, the young princess fell into the trap. She looked at him with a fierce grin on her face, because she knew it, and he thought he had fooled her. Earlier, he had interrupted their conversation and asked for forgiveness, but still told them about the lake and the kingdom. She knew that he had infiltrated the palace as a princess, and it was genius on his part. The princess noticed that his action was different from the locals, so she assumed that he was not a local, so she decided to play along with his so-called genius plan. She took advantage of the situation and voluntarily fell into the trap. But she was surprised when they used sleep magic and teleportation. She realized that the king of these places himself was quite cunning. As she fell asleep, she told the young man that at their next meeting, she would kill him. At the same time, Isabella screamed and called for her mistress with all her might. She reached out to her, but it was all in vain. She, the lady, was puzzled, as she understood that she had only frightened her nanny with such behavior. At the same time, the emperor was more important than the documents in the palace. A moment later, he heard some noise. Isabella burst into the emperor's office and shouted that the princess had been captured by the kingdom. She shouted that she had been kidnapped, but a moment later, out of helplessness, she fell to the ground. Sedelt looked at the emperor with excitement and called him. The emperor angrily told his subordinate to immediately hold a council. At the same time, the king burst into wild laughter. He was glad and considered himself a genius because he knew that the princess was still a simple child, and they only had to deliver a few compliments to the young princess, and she would immediately melt. He knew that as soon as she stepped onto their territory, she was caught like a bird in a cage. The king looked at the young man closely and asked what had happened to the princess's nanny. Bowing, the young man said that she had been sent back to the Eastern Empire, and they would soon find out that the princess had been captured by the kingdom. The king was very proud of his victory. Caraseri looked closely at her brother and said with a joyful smile that the princess would soon wake up and he should go to her. He smiled and said that he just wanted to go visit the bird. He said with a satisfied smile that he had heard earlier that the young princess was an exact copy of the emperor, and he wanted to know if this was true. Caraseri said that during their first meeting, the young princess disguised herself as an adult lady. She knew that the princess used magic to transform herself. The king said with a smile that he was very interested and would go and look at her at once. The princess said with a smile to her brother that he should go and that she would soon join their conversation. She also said that he should enjoy this moment. At the same time, the young princess sat in the dungeon, imprisoned by magic. A moment later, the king nevertheless went down to the young princess in the dungeon, but in turn, he looked at the young lady with cold fury. So infuriated were the fair-haired ones. He saw that she had cows on her, which were holding back her magic. He wanted to see how things would go next. A moment later, he approached her, and with a grin asked if she had woken up, their little bird. The princess cursed very beautifully and told him to immediately take his ugly mug away from her, and she also told him not to call her little bird, as it sounded disgusting, but she called him Red Rooster. He froze for a moment in shock, as he had not expected such a thing, and stared intently at the young princess as she waved her arms in different directions. But a moment later, he laughed wildly. He looked at her with a grin and said that she had a tongue like a broomstick. But still it wouldn't help her, because she was now wearing special shackles with the seal of their kingdom. Alicia looked at him with cold fury and asked if it was he who put the crippling shackles with the seal on her, while she cursed and called him names. He asked with a smirk why she didn't take them off if she was so smart. He sighed heavily and said that she should wait a little, because there would be fun soon. The young princess looked at him in bewilderment, and he asked with a smirk on his face if she was interested in what would happen next. He said that he was very curious if the emperor of the Eastern Empire was really as cold as ice toward his only daughter. He was curious if he was ready to give up on saving her. The young princess froze in place for a moment. He said with cold fury that he still wondered what her father would say when he found out that his little bird was being held captive by the kingdom. Alicia froze, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the princess came down to their dungeon. Alicia looked at the young lady in surprise, as she didn't understand why she was here. Caraseri looked closely at her brother and informed him that the message had already been delivered to the Eastern Empire. Alicia was taken aback for a moment when she saw the magic ball, but she was even more surprised when she saw her father and his help. The king looked at the magic ball with a grin and told the emperor that he was glad to see his ugly face. Cadell asked with a smirk what the emperor would say. Looking at his daughter, Alicia sighed heavily and looked at the king with cold fury, as this is what he called negotiations. The emperor looked at the king with cold fury and told him to tell him immediately what he was trying to achieve. Cadell told the emperor with a grin that he was still as heartless as ever. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly, waiting for an answer. A moment later, the king put a dagger to the princess's throat and told the emperor that he would kill his princess today. She sighed heavily and wondered if he really had such jokes. The king said with a grin that if the emperor himself came for her, then so be it, he would endure the execution. With a fierce grin, he looked straight at the emperor and asked what he would say in response. He wanted to know if the emperor wanted to delay the princess's execution for a day. The emperor, in turn, did not answer, but a moment later the magic ball cracked and crumbled. The young princess was surprised, as she did not understand what had happened at all. She wondered if her father had simply cut off contact. A moment later, the king laughed wildly and told the princess that it seemed her father did not love her. Cadell looked at the young princess with a sneer and said that she could not even use the situation that she had earned. He wondered what she would do next, because her father had abandoned her. The young princess, in turn, told the king to shut his mouth immediately, and the king froze in place as he saw her magic. A moment later, there was a deafening explosion. After the explosion, the king was thrown into the wall. The princess looked at the king with fury and said that he got the fun he deserved, and she also called him a red-headed rooster. Moments later, she came closer to him and asked with cold fury if he was having fun. He looked closely at the young princess and said that she really was a monster, worse than the emperor. Caraseri looked closely at the young princess and said that family sometimes seems close, but is actually further away than those who are at a distance. Alicia looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Caraseri told the young princess that she considered the emperor her family. She said that they were related, but they saw each other less often than an eclipse. Alicia looked at her with cold fury, but said nothing. A moment later, the king looked closely at the young princess with a smirk on his face. He asked if she wanted to forget about the emperor's heart. He looked at her intently and, coming closer, asked if she would like to take their side. She sighed heavily and told him to stop talking nonsense. Caraseri looked at the young princess with a smirk and asked if she still loved her father, who didn't care about her. Alicia pushed the young lady away with lightning speed, but she, in turn, said that she would bring her nanny to their kingdom. The king looked at the young princess and said that her nanny was closer to him than the emperor. He grinned and told the young princess that they only wanted one thing from her. They wanted her to help them when needed. Alicia looked at the king with cold fury, but said nothing. The king, with lightning speed, put his dagger to the young lady's throat and asked the emperor what he would say. He wanted to know if he would postpone the execution of the princess for a day. But a moment later, the ball exploded. The emperor was surprised and shocked. Since they had not touched it with a finger, he did not understand why it exploded. The emperor was furious, because he did not understand what exactly the king had planned. The young man looked intently at the emperor, waiting for his actions. The ministers proposed to immediately raise an army, but they knew that if they started a war after the one that had long ended, they would face great losses. They said that the princess was strong and could get out on her own, but the man was furious and shouted that the kingdom had declared war on them. The baron shouted that if the kingdom was involved in new black magic, then they would not be able to defeat him. For some time, the emperor sat quietly and watched everyone closely, pondering the situation. A moment later, he called his assistant. With cold fury, he looked into the distance and said that the assistant must immediately gather the entire army. At the same time, everything was quiet and calm in the kingdom. The king and his sister were sitting quietly at the table. Moments later, they turned around as they saw a young princess walking towards them. Karaseri smiled and told the princess that she could sit at the table next to them. The princess looked at them with cold fury, for she saw before her only mangy chickens. A moment later, the princess sat down at the table and, looking at the young people, asked if they were brother and sister. At that very moment, they joyfully announced to the princess that it was true, and they, brother and sister, she looked at them in surprise, as she did not understand what kind of atmosphere of a sweet family was in front of her. She looked at them with cold fury and asked if the murders on the day of the debutante's ball were really their doing. She asked if they were the ones who distributed the drug through the underground auction. The king said with a joyful smile that everything was true, and it was all at his doing. But he did not want to boast, but still said that he was very good at black magic. A moment later, the princess grabbed the knife and with lightning speed threw the knife at Karaseri. But the young lady did not even move. Alicia looked at the king with fury and asked if he was making fun of her. The king looked at the young princess with cold fury and anger. As she dared to harm his sister, Karaseri told her brother to sit down. Karaseri looked at the princess intently and told her to understand them, as her brother had been very keen to free her from the dungeon that day. Alicia, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and said that she was speaking in too joyful a tone. Karaseri sighed heavily and asked how she could not be happy, because she was now having breakfast with her brother, and with a new family that is already on their side. Alicia sighed heavily and looked away from them, because she knew that she would have to clean up all the mess. She did not understand what kind of life she had. Karaseri looked intently at the young princess and asked if she wanted to know anything else. Alicia sighed heavily and said, "Young lady, she spread the drug throughout the empire. She also planted black magicians on their lands and then started an underground auction to sell slaves." Alicia looked at the young lady with a cold, hard look and told her to explain everything to her in great detail. Karaseri sighed heavily and said that it was her fault, but she could swear that they didn't do this to destabilize the empire. The princess, in turn, looked intently at the young lady, waiting for an answer. She said that if the princess helps their kingdom, there will be no more nuances. Alicia looked closely at the young men, because she had guessed earlier, but now she was sure of her guesses and realized that the empire and the kingdoms were enemies until death. She looked closely at them and asked what was required of her. The king looked at the young princess with a grin and said that they would inform her when everything was ready. She looked at them with a smile and said that she agreed and would wait until that moment. At the same time, Isabella felt very strange, because she had just told about the kidnapping of the princess. She wondered if she was really dead after all. She knew it was very unfair. But at that moment, she heard the voice of her beloved princess and reached out to her. She understood that she could not die because she had made a promise to the princess that she would protect her. A moment later, she woke up and was breathing heavily as she had a feeling of fear and anxiety. Alicia looked at her nanny worriedly and asked if she was okay. She wanted to know if she had been having a nightmare. A moment later, young Isabella rushed forward and embraced her princess with tears in her eyes. She looked closely at her mistress and asked if she was all right and if she was hurt anywhere. Alicia said with a gentle smile that she was safe and sound. Isabella, in turn, breathed a sigh of relief. But a moment later, she still asked the young princess where they were now. Alicia hesitated for a moment, but after a few seconds she said that they were now in the kingdom, and circumstances forced them to stay. In such a place, Isabella was shocked. She did not expect anything like this. Alicia looked closely at her nanny, and with a gentle smile said that if she did not want to be here, she could go back to the empire. She looked intently at her nanny, waiting for an answer. But a moment later, Isabella said that she would not do it, because she could not leave her. Alicia told her nanny that it was still an enemy country, so she asked her if she was sure of her choice. Isabella looked at the princess with a joyful smile and said that, of course, she would be next to her, always and everywhere, so the princess could not worry about this. She said that she was still worried because of her ignorance of the king's plan. After all, there had been rumors for a long time that he had mastered black magic. The princess smiled and told her nanny not to worry about that, because if he tried to resist, she would simply kill him. Alicia looked at her nanny with a happy smile, as she was ready to protect her no matter what. Isabella sighed heavily, for she knew that her princess was incorrigible. At the same time, the emperor would sit quietly in his office and ponder the situation. He was furious when he saw that the ball had cracked. Then the ministers told him that there was no need to rush to gather an army. Considering that they had chosen the princess's nanny right under their noses, they did not want to get involved once again, because they understood that if they went there, trouble could not be avoided. They told the emperor that he was endangering not only himself, but also the entire army of the empire. The emperor looked closely at everyone present and firmly and confidently informed everyone that he would go alone to the palace of the kingdom. Sedilt was shocked by the emperor's statement. The ministers shouted that this was the height of recklessness, because he had only recently returned from a campaign and was now about to leave again, and alone too. The emperor, in turn, looked at everyone present with cold fury but did not answer. From his gaze, everyone quickly fell silent. He sighed heavily and, rising, said that he would set out at dawn and asked his assistant to inform everyone. The emperor was furious because he had a disgusting feeling. He understood that everything was because of the damned king and his provocation. He knew his daughter and understood that she would not sit back and cry. A moment later, a servant entered the emperor's office with tea. Sedilt looked intently at the maid and said that he would do everything himself from now on. He looked at the emperor and said that they had brought him tea, even though he had not asked for it. A few minutes later, the young man said that he would see the advisors off and come to him again. But he still asked the emperor to reconsider his decision again. A few seconds later, the young man froze in place from the guy, as he saw that the emperor had been poisoned. With lightning speed, he rushed to the emperor, as he was very worried and asked if he was okay. He was in shock and shouted to call a doctor quickly, but the emperor grabbed his assistant by the hand and looked at him with a cold and angry gaze, but unfortunately, he was unable to say anything. At the same time, the young princess was dining with the king and princess. The king said with a satisfied smile that the wine had a wonderful aroma. The princess, in turn, looked at the king with cold fury and asked why on earth she should look at his face so early in the morning. He said with a smirk that she should do it because the preparation was over. Alicia looked at him in bewilderment. The king smiled and asked if she was ready to help them with her strength. He said that the day he asked her to stand by their side had come. Caraseri looked closely at the young princess and said that she had the main role in the performance. Alicia looked at them coldly and told them to stop going around the back streets and tell her what she needed to do. A moment later, the king showed her a small bottle and said with a grin that she must have guessed what exactly it was. She was shocked to see the drug in his hands. He said with a grin that everything was correct, but this was not an ordinary drug, but also a poison. He looked at the young princess with a fierce grin and said that this poison had gotten into the emperor's seagull. Alicia froze in place in surprise. She knew that if a person who was heavily influenced by black magic took such a drug, only death would await him. Black magic burned not only the flesh, but also the soul. She knew that it could not be used on people. She knew that the emperor had survived the first assassination attempt using black magic. She understood that since he had taken the drug, he could have already died. She looked at the young men and asked if the emperor was so stupid that he just drank the poison himself. The king smiled and said that of course it was not so, and it was all thanks to the spies they had planted. He boasted that it had taken a long time, but the goal had been achieved. Caraseri looked at her brother and said with a smile that it was time for them to lay all their cards on the table. She said with a grin that since you are in the emperor's chambers, a teleporter has been installed, which they have carefully worked on. The emperor would wake up very soon because his magic was fighting black magic, so they had little time. The king looked at the young princess with a grin and said that now was her turn. He looked at the princess with a fierce grin and said that the moment the teleporter transferred the emperor, she would have to behead him. Alicia looked at him with cold fury and asked if he really wanted her to sign up for this. Cadell said with a grin that the emperor did not love her, so he did not understand why she would protect someone who was a stranger to her. He said that for her it was just a trifle, but a moment later, Isabella entered the room and shouted that this was not right. She looked at her princess and said that she couldn't do that. Alicia, in turn, rushed to her nanny with lightning speed. Caraseri was puzzled, since she did not notice how the princess's nanny came to them. Isabella was shocked. She spoke about the princess, that although he does not love her, he is still her father. She said that if the princess kills the one who gave her life and takes the throne, this will not be her consolation. Caraseri looked at the young lady intently and said that if her mistress had decided to go that way, then she should not stand in her way. Isabella looked at them intently and said that it was not so, and she would not allow such a thing to happen. She looked at the princess intently, but a moment later turned her gaze to everyone present and said that they should not even dream of using the princess's power for their own purposes. Alicia looked at her nanny and asked her to leave. Because she understood everything, Isabella was in shock. She said that she would not leave and would not leave her. She said that until the princess gives a promise that she will not do this, she will be by her side and will not back down. At the same time, the king was burning with anger and fury, since some nanny was interfering with their plan. Caraseri looked at her brother with excitement and asked him to stop. The king looked at the young lady with fury and said that she was just an impudent nanny. He shouted that she was just a nanny for the princess. Isabella, in turn, froze in place as he frightened her greatly. Caraseri called her brother and asked him to stop, but it was all in vain. The king, with cold fury, quickly struck Isabella, and she fell to the ground with a crash. Alicia froze in place for a moment, as she did not expect this. A moment later, she turned around and looked at the king with cold fury, for he had just struck her nanny, and she was burning with anger and rage. The king looked mockingly at the young princess and said that her nanny was too impudent. Alicia looked at the king with cold fury and said that because she had been a good girl, they decided that they kept her on a leash. She looked at him in anger and said that he had made a mistake because he had hit Isabella and thus signed his own death warrant by crossing that line. A moment later, the brother and sister looked at the young princess in shock as she used her magic. They saw that magic was enveloping her. Alicia, in turn, aimed at the young people. A moment later, she used her magic on them and enveloped them. The king tried to use his magic in response. At the same time, the young lady was suffocating as she was being strangled by the princess's magic. After some time, a deafening explosion thundered. The king was in shock as he could not do anything, and at the same time, the magic of the young princess was pressing on him and he could not breathe. After a few minutes, the princess looked closely at the young people who were lying on the ground. She knew that everything could not just end like that. Alicia hurried to her nanny and looked at her intently. A few seconds later, she used magic to heal her nanny. She sighed heavily and asked the nanny for forgiveness for putting her through such a thing. She wanted to return home with her as soon as possible. At the same time, the emperor was lying in his bed, having been poisoned. But a moment later, he managed to get up. He was furious because he knew that the king had managed to plant a spy in his palace. As soon as he stepped on the ground, teleport immediately started working. A few seconds later, the emperor disappeared from his room without a trace. After some time, he opened his eyes but noticed that his sword was next to him, but it was tied up. He looked around as he realized that this room was not like their palace dungeon. But when he got up, he froze in place, as he saw his daughter in front of him. Robertus looked at his daughter in surprise and called her. She didn't answer, but only sighed heavily. But a moment later, she said coldly that if she had only been a normal child, she would have long since become a cold corpse. She looked at the emperor intently and asked if he understood this. He sighed heavily and asked if she understood that her actions could be considered treason. She said that if he wanted to throw her out, then he should have treated her even worse than anyone else. Alicia asked sadly if it would have been better for him to just kill her as a baby. She knew he felt sadness and anger at the loss of his beloved, but that did not give him any reason to smooth over his guilt. She looked at her father intently, wanting an answer from him, but he only looked silently at the floor, without raising his gaze to her. But a few seconds later, he said that he never wanted a child. Alicia froze in shock. She never wanted love, and did not expect it at all. But a moment later, someone's gentle voice sounded in her head, asking if she really did not want even the slightest drop of love. She could not withstand the onslaught of all her feelings, and began to strangle the emperor. She was furious because she knew it was true, and she had hoped for this love. She looked at the emperor with cold fury, for she knew that she did not want this now. A moment later, she raised her sword and pointed it at her father. Alicia looked at the emperor intently and said that she heard his answer. He sighed heavily, knowing that it would be nice if she dealt with him right now. But a moment later, she simply burst into tears. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise as he saw her tears. But after a few seconds, she swung the ball and shouted that he should die and never appear before her again. A moment later, she was transported to the other world. The young man looked at his friend with a smile and urged him on as he knew that the wedding ceremony was about to begin. The young princess, in turn, looked into the distance in bewilderment, since she did not understand what was happening at all and where she was. She saw a crowd of people who were enjoying every moment. All the people greeted the emperor and empress with joy and wished them happiness. Alicia froze for a moment as she saw her father and mother looking at each other with tenderness and warmth. She saw their passionate kiss, which was filled with love and warmth. She froze and stared at them, not listening to anyone around her. The empress asked her husband with a smile what he intended to show her. He tenderly closed her eyes with his palms and told her where to go, and also said that she would soon see everything for herself. A moment later, they were teleported to a completely different place, and he said with a smile that she could now open her eyes. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was really what he wanted to show her. He smiled and said that it was true, although it took a very long time. The young lady was taken aback for a moment as she remembered the place when she saw the emperor, who was sitting quietly next to him. She froze for a moment as she realized that this was their secret place. The empress looked at her husband with tenderness and thanked him. The doctor sighed heavily and informed the emperor and empress that the empress was barren, and most likely the reason was her weakness. The empress, barely holding back her tears, said that she was fine. The emperor rushed to his wife as he was very excited. He was worried about her, but she smiled and said that she was fine and that it was not so important now. She sighed heavily and said that she was very sorry. He was shocked and shouted at her not to say such a thing. The emperor said that he only needed her, and he did not need a successor at all. That same night, the young empress prayed to the night witch and asked her to grant her a child. She prayed and asked the witch because she wanted to see their child. The young princess was in shock. She couldn't understand everything. But at the same time, the empress sighed heavily and said that she knew that her husband really wanted children. She said that it was not only for her sake, but also for the sake of their child. She really wanted her husband to feel love for their child. The empress really wanted them to have a happy family, and their child too. The young princess was in shock. She understood that something truly terrible had happened. Looking back, she began to realize that everything was very strange. She wondered why she had offended the emperor, why he had retreated and hidden her. Why did she decide to become an emperor? After all, she knew that the Eastern Empire could be easily destroyed. After all, she understood that there was a sea of oddities in her. She did not understand why she simply lived like no one else. The empress, with tears in her eyes, prayed to the White Knight's witch and said that she and her beloved were not family, and she did not understand the meaning of her life, but their beloved child would become the meaning for her. She asked the White Knight's witch to let her see her child. At that moment, the White Knight witch agreed and fulfilled her sincere wish. After all, back then, she also wanted to feel what it meant to be loved. So then she set some kind of limitation. The magic called desire. Its magical power returned on the day the news of the emperor's death arrived. And her magical power was limited, so she could not harm or kill the emperor. She knew that it was a very unpleasant feeling that she experienced every time she realized that she was not loved. After much effort, the empress was finally able to give the emperor their child. But that same day, the doctor informed the emperor that the empress was getting worse and would soon leave their world. The emperor was in shock. He screamed and called his love, but everything was fair. He screamed that they could live without her for a minute. He asked her not to leave him, but she looked at him with her tender smile and with the last of her strength, told him to stop refusing her and their child together. She hoped that he would love the child and asked him to give her a promise. A moment later, the emperor released his wife's hand and said that he had heard that in the Western Empire there grew a medicinal herb that would heal a man from any disease. He turned around and, as he left, said that he would find this herb, and he made her a promise. The empress was in shock. She called her husband, but it was all in vain. The young princess, in turn, watched closely at her mother, who was breathing heavily after giving birth. She looked closely at the empress as she became worse and worse. But a moment later, the empress glanced sideways at the young princess. Alicia shuddered. She wondered if the Empress had seen her. A moment later, Alicia told the Empress that she had made her wish. She asked her if this was really what she wanted. The Empress smiled tenderly at the young princess in response, but a moment later, she said that the last months of her life had been the happiest for her. The Empress looked at her daughter with a tender smile and said that if she didn't want to, she didn't have to do it. She told her daughter that she should live her life and not worry about anything. The young princess was in shock as she realized that the wish was cut short. Sometime later, the young princess was lying in her bed. The doctor informed the emperor that the princess had no particular health problems. He sighed heavily and said he thought she had simply passed out after going through something like that. The emperor, in turn, looked intently at his daughter. He remembered the moment when she screamed and asked him to get out of her sight. He looked at his daughter intently, for he was not sure that he could love a child who had been exchanged with the life of his beloved. When he first saw his daughter, he was momentarily taken aback. He took the child tenderly in his arms and looked at her intently with sadness on his face. Robertus knew that he could not hate the child of his beloved. It wasn't that he hadn't been to the princess's palace. He was worried that he might blame his child. For this reason, he only watched her from afar. He saw that she was a very playful and cheerful girl, but still it hurt him to look at her. But he didn't recognize the little girl he met after several years of war, because she didn't have that innocent child's look, so he decided to just pretend. But still he saw her beautiful and alluring eyes, which were filled with rage and which told him that she did not need his love. Therefore, he believed that she did not consider him her father. But unfortunately, he realized everything too late, because, in truth, his little daughter only craved love. The doctor looked at the emperor with puzzlement, as he saw that he was angry. Robertus, in turn, looked sideways with anger at the doctor and asked why his daughter was not waking up. The doctor, trembling with fear, said that, as he had previously reported, the princess was in good health, but he could not understand the reason for her condition. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. But a moment later, he stood up and drew his sword from its sheath. The doctor trembled with fear. The young man looked at the emperor with a worried expression and said that he should not kill the doctor at all. Robertus looked at his assistant with fury and asked why he shouldn't do it. The young man said that the best doctor in the empire was now in front of the emperor. He said that the matter was different now, and most likely, the reason for everything was the dream of the young princess. A moment later, the emperor could not bear it any longer and threw his sword to the left side in anger. He looked closely at the magician and asked if there could be black magic behind this. The young man sighed heavily and said that no symptoms of black magic were found. Robertus looked at everyone present with cold fury and asked if they could solve this problem. The young man sighed heavily and said that at this point in time, they did not have a solution. The emperor looked intently at his daughter, who was sleeping quietly and peacefully. A moment later, he called his assistant. Robertus told his assistant to immediately gather all the magicians who were able to draw magic circles of teleportation. The young man was taken aback. He did not understand why the emperor needed such a thing. The emperor said furiously that he would immediately go to the Western Empire. The young man was astonished. He asked the emperor if he really wanted to fight here again, but the emperor said that was not the case and that he should go to the Black Forest. Sometime later, the princess finally woke up. She sighed heavily, as her head hurt a lot, and she did not understand where she was now. A moment later, she heard someone calling her and turned around. Davian looked at the princess with tears in his eyes and asked what he should have done if she had not woken up. The doctor spoke to the princess with tears in his eyes that he was very glad that she had finally woken up. She sighed heavily and asked them to explain the whole situation to her. He sighed heavily and said that while she was unconscious, the emperor was going to behead them, and they were very glad that she finally woke up. She looked at them puzzled as she understood that her father was just an idiot. She wondered if he had abandoned her. A moment later, Isabella entered the princess's room and hurriedly asked the young lady how she was feeling. Alicia sighed heavily and said that she was fine. Alicia looked closely at the young men and asked where her father was and where he had gone. Isabella looked at her mistress intently and said that the emperor would go to the Black Forest, which was in the west. The young princess was shocked and did not understand why he went there. Isabella sighed heavily and said that she did not know the details, but it seemed that he went to the Western Empire to obtain a medicinal plant that cures all diseases. She sighed heavily as he started up again, but she was also very worried about him. At the same time, the Emperor arrived in the Western Empire, together with the magician. The Emperor sighed heavily and told the young man to wait for him at the place, as he did not want him to get under his feet. The young man, in turn, was not going to resist him and carried out the Emperor's order. A moment later, the Emperor entered the depths of the forest and looked around intently. He knew that the legendary Black Forest was filled with monsters and beasts that protected medicinal plants. Unfortunately, many years ago, he was unable to enter these lands due to lack of strength. A moment later, he turned around as he heard the roar of the animals. With lightning speed, he drew his sword from its sheath and began to deal with the monsters that were flying towards him. Robertus was glad that this time he was able to enter these lands. He was not going to retreat and began to clear out the monsters. He easily dealt with every monster that he encountered on his difficult path. A moment later, he approached a large tree and froze in place. But after a few seconds, he found what he came for. Robertus reached for the legendary herb. But a moment later, he felt something was wrong and recoiled. He realized that he was being led willingly by the defender of the medicinal herb. Robertus prepared for battle, as he was not going to give up. A moment later, they began to attack him, but he easily dodged each blow. He realized that he had to pick this herb right now. But a moment later, the Emperor came across a block. He was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, as he felt some kind of ominous energy. A feeling of death washed over him, the first he had experienced in a long time since he became a swordmaster. He understood that if the tree touched him, he would die, not even saving his daughter. He understood perfectly well that he had to retreat immediately. He rushed with lightning speed to the court magician who was waiting for him. He shouted to the young man that they must return to the palace immediately. At the same time, the young princess sat quietly in her room and ate slowly. At that very moment, her meal was spoiled as the Emperor returned unexpectedly. The young princess looked at them intently as they set out for the Black Forest and returned safe and sound. A moment later, the Emperor looked at his daughter and was taken aback. He was surprised that she had woken up. But at that very moment, everyone heard some kind of rumble. They were in shock, because they did not understand what was happening. Isabella hastily wondered if it was really an earthquake. The princess looked intently at everyone present. Moments later, she asked the Emperor if he had ever touched the world tree from the Black Forest. She looked at her father hard, hoping he would say he didn't do it. But the Emperor simply looked away without answering, and he felt guilty. The young princess was shocked as she understood that he had done something wrong. A moment later, a loud roar erupted, and the walls of the palace shook. Alicia looked at the Emperor intently and told him to evacuate everyone from the palace immediately, and also said that it would be better for him not to show his face. But a moment later, Karma caught up with them. The young man looked at the Emperor with fury and asked if he really wanted to run away. Everyone was taken aback for a moment as they saw a young man who was floating in the sky and was blacker than a cloud. At that very moment, the young princess created a protective dome to protect everyone present in the room. She was furious because she knew that there were many people in the palace that needed to be protected. The young man looked at everyone present and said that he had not felt the power of the moonlight lately. He did not understand what was happening at all. Alicia looked at him closely and asked why he couldn't be more careful, saying his name as she did so. Kashan looked at the young lady intently and said that she should be silent, as he only wanted the Emperor. He looked at the young lady with fury and said that the Emperor was trying to cut off the branches of the world tree. She was shocked because he didn't just want to touch the world tree, but cut it off. She looked intently at the Emperor, but he did not even look at her. Kashan shouted at the young lady not to even think about protecting the Emperor. After all, he had come all this long way for him. She sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness, but still said that they were relatives and she could not give him away. Kashan said that her body was currently a child's, but he did not understand what was happening to her mind. He asked if she had become stupid. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really thought she was a child only in body. She said that she thought he would figure it out himself because they had a long way to go. She knew that she should have pulled up as much time as possible. Kashan looked at her with a grin and asked how many hundreds of years had passed. He asked if she wanted to continue. She looked at him with a fierce grin as if she wanted him to catch her. The princess sighed heavily because she knew that in any case, everything would end in evacuation. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled, because the black magic had spread so much that her nose even started itching. But a moment later, she used her magic and began to float in the air. She knew that there was only one thing left for her to do, and that was to wipe away all the powder. A moment later, she focused all her energy on the young boy. He was taken aback. She looked at him intently and said that they could end this here and now. She didn't understand why he destroyed the palace and brought everything into chaos. But a moment later, he directed dark magic at her. She easily parried his blow. But a moment later, there was a powerful explosion as their magics touched. The princess looked around carefully, as she wanted to know where he had hidden. Alicia turned around as she felt someone behind her, but a moment later he struck her. She looked at him with cold fury and said that he was crossing the line, since he chopped off her hair. She screamed that if she caught him, it would all be over. He looked at her with a smirk and asked if she hadn't said earlier that she would catch him. Kashan looked at the young princess with a fierce grin and said that they could try again. She looked at him intently, because she knew that he really had decided to do something like this. She sighed heavily, because she knew that he had given her a headache. But a moment later, the emperor stood in front of her and blocked her with his body. She froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect anything like this. A few seconds later, the young man dealt the emperor a crushing blow, and he fell to the ground with a crash. Alicia was shocked. She did not understand what the young man was doing at all. He sighed heavily and said that the emperor was incredibly stupid, and he was just a helpless baby in a crown. Everyone was in shock. They were shouting that they needed to call a doctor immediately because they saw the state of the emperor's hand, but they knew that first they needed to return to the palace. Kashan sighed when he saw the commotion. He was puzzled, as they were making a big deal out of nothing. But the young princess couldn't take it anymore and hit the young man in anger, and he fell to the ground with a crash. He was shocked. He didn't understand why she was fighting. She sighed heavily, but did not answer his question. She looked closely at her father, who was writhing in pain, sitting on the ground. Sometime later, the emperor was carried to his chambers. She knew that now she had no problem controlling her power, even being next to the emperor. She understood that her wish had come true. Alicia was well aware of the fact that her father was vulnerable to dark magic. She knew that he could easily die if hit by a young man who was no match for the king's strength, but what surprised her more was that he had held out for so long. She knew that since this Irana was caused by black magic, they should have gone to a doctor, because no magician from the magic tower could cure the emperor. But she knew that the young man who inflicted the wound could help him. But she also knew that she was the one who could save her father. A moment later, she turned around and walked into the next room. She walked in and looked intently at the young man, who greeted her with a joyful smile. He sighed heavily and said with a smile, "The emperor had stank the entire castle, and the stench from his hand had even reached him." Kashan looked closely at the young princess and asked what she intended to do next. He said that she could also cure him. She sighed heavily and said that it was so, but she didn't understand what it meant. He smiled and asked if she herself hadn't mentioned their blood ties. He didn't understand why she didn't go and treat her father. She sighed heavily and told him to stop asking stupid questions, as he was annoying her. He smiled and said that, considering her age, she was rather petty. Kashan said that it seemed that she was a child not only in body, but also in brain. She looked at him with fury and said that he had not experienced anything like that, and also asked if he could imagine how she had to live all this time. He sighed heavily and said that he was not interested. Alicia looked at the young man and asked if he had made a contract with the king. She was furious and asked the young man if he knew how many of his misdeeds she had to go over. While drinking tea, the young man asked if she had really dealt with him. He looked at her intently and smiled and told her to stop beating around the bush. He asked what she was going to do with the emperor. Kashan asked the young lady with a smirk if she was really going to leave things as they were. He said that she had been through a lot as a person, so he asked if it was that difficult. She stood up abruptly and told the young man to shut his mouth immediately, but he only looked at the young lady with her satisfied smile. A moment later, he asked her where she was going. Alicia turned around and said he was just a little bastard. He looked after her with a smile, because he knew that the emperor would be glad that the rain had saved his life. At the same time, everyone was closely watching the emperor's condition, but a moment later they were taken aback as the young princess entered the room and told everyone that she needed to speak with the emperor in private. So she asked everyone to step outside for a while. They were shocked because they knew that the emperor had not even opened his eyes. She looked coldly at everyone present and said that she knew it very well. They sighed heavily, but still obeyed the princess's order. The young man looked at everyone intently and said that they could go and have a cup of tea. A moment later, Alicia moved closer to her father and looked at him intently. She sighed heavily and used her magic. A few seconds later, the emperor opened his eyes and looked at his daughter in surprise. She looked at him intently and asked why he had so insistently closed her behind his back. She said that he was familiar with black magic. She sighed heavily and said that he already knew perfectly well what a contract with black magic entailed. Robertus looked at his daughter and said that it was all useless, and it wasn't that he wasn't in pain. She looked at him with a smirk because she knew what he had answered: stupid. The princess asked if now, standing in front of her, he still wanted to stand in her way. He sighed heavily and said that the wasp regretted everything. She sighed heavily and said with a grin that it was very stupid. But the emperor said that he was wrong. He looked at his daughter intently and said in all seriousness that it was wrong to lock her in the palace. She was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that he was simply afraid of losing her as his wife. Bursting into tears, he said that he was not sure that he could improve his life. She looked at him in surprise and automatically reached out. But a moment later she stopped and said that she didn't care and she would never forgive him. He looked at his daughter intently and said that he did not expect forgiveness, and he was just saying such words to clear up the misunderstanding, and nothing more. She looked at him with cold fury and said that a simple apology was no reason to forget his guilt for everything he had done throughout his life. But a moment later, the young princess still used her magic on the emperor, and he felt light. But he was also surprised, because he did not expect this. She was puzzled, but at the same time she knew that the past could not be returned, and what had happened could not be erased. He froze in place for a moment as he saw that the black magic was leaving, and his hand was fine. The young lady, in turn, could not forgive the emperor so easily. A moment later, she declared to her father that she would become emperor. She looked at him intently and said that the most valuable and rare thing the emperor owned was his throne. The emperor, in turn, looked intently at his daughter, but a moment later, he said he needed to show her something. The young princess, in turn, followed her father without asking unnecessary questions. She saw a secret room in the imperial palace where there were photographs of the empress and the emperor. She froze for a moment, near the photograph. She was surprised because she saw the emperor, who was holding her little one. She looked intently at the emperor and asked if he really wanted to arouse his sympathy for her. The emperor, in turn, sighed heavily and said that she had previously said that she would not forgive him, but he planned to spend the rest of his life apologizing to her. But a moment later, he looked at her intently and said that the emperor's power was a different matter, because he would never declare her crown princess. Robertus said that the place of the next emperor will always be vacant. Looking at his daughter, he said that this means the place of the emperor can be taken by anyone, regardless of imperial blood. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that this was what she had hoped for. Alicia told her father that she did not need his help in advancing to become the heir to the throne. He said with a smile that this was very good, but she must prove that she was worthy of wearing the crown on her head, and she must make the throne her own. Alicia looked at him intently and said with a smile that she would definitely achieve this. Some time later, the young princess and her nanny were walking around the city. Isabella looked at her mistress with a smile and congratulated her on her birthday. Alicia smiled and thanked her nanny. Isabella smiled and said that it was the princess's birthday today. She asked her if she would like to visit the night market. Isabella said that the emperor had mentioned a grand celebration. The princess said that it was all right, because she didn't particularly like that. But she hurried her nanny. Alicia looked at her nanny and asked with a smile if she hadn't wanted to see this play earlier. Isabella smiled and said that of course she wanted to see it, because the story was quite romantic, as it was a love story between lovers who met after hundreds of years. Some time later, they attended a play. Isabella, in turn, was moved to tears, as the story was beautiful. Sometime after the play, they amused themselves by wandering around the city. Isabella looked closely at her princess and said with a smile that she would like to go and buy a nice mask. A moment later, Isabella bought the princess a cat mask. The princess was surprised, as she did not understand why her nanny chose a cat. Isabella smiled and said that her princess got along very well with cats. The young princess was taken aback for a moment. She saw a blurry image in front of her. It was a young man who asked with a smile if she really didn't get along with cats. She saw them walking through the city at night and having a casual conversation. She froze for a moment and was taken aback because she did not understand what kind of memories these were. Isabella looked at the princess worriedly and asked if something was wrong. The princess smiled and said that everything was fine. A moment later, Isabella suggested that the princess go back to the castle, but on the way, they saw a beautiful fireworks display, which eclipsed the night sky. Alicia, in turn, looked back and stared at the small stand with masks. She was a little alarmed and at the same time puzzled, as everything seemed very familiar to her. As the seasons changed, the landscape changed too. Fallen petals circled the ground, and leaves changed color and fell. Snow fell repeatedly and melted again. Before she knew it, 9 years had flown by. The maid looked closely at the young princess and asked if she was going to meet his duke's daughter today. The maid happily asked the princess what dress she wanted to wear. A moment later, the maid, with a joyful smile, told the princess that she looked beautiful as always. She looked at the dress with admiration, as it fit her very well. Moments later, the maid told the princess that the emperor's birthday was in a week. She asked the princess if she would like to throw a banquet to celebrate the event. Alicia sighed heavily and said that was true, but she had no ideas yet. Even when they dined together, they never brought up the topic. They both remained silent during the meal, and this happened more than once. The maid said that if they held a party in the palace after so much time, the emperor would be given more than 1 or 2 gifts. The maid looked at the young princess and asked if she had thought of what gift she would give to the emperor. Alicia thought about the gift for a moment. Elizabeth looked at the princess closely and asked if she was sure that this would suit her, as she knew many other jewelry shops. The princess smiled and said that it was all right, because she had considered the idea of the brooch from the very beginning. Elizabeth smiled and said that it was very good, and she hoped that the princess was pleased. Moments later, Alicia asked her friend if she had a trip with her fiancé. Elizabeth, with an embarrassed look on her face, told the princess that when she had time, she should visit her mansion, because she wanted to show her the roses he gave her. The young princess smiled and said that she would definitely come to see me next time. Elizabeth looked at the princess closely and asked if she was considering the idea of marriage. She said that the princess was already at the age when she should think about marriage. Alicia sighed heavily and said that she had not thought about it yet. Elizabeth told her friend that she had better not delay it, but better late than never. A moment later, their sweet conversation was interrupted, as the young lady shouted that her handbag had been stolen. The young man ran away in a hurry and shouted at everyone to disperse. Elizabeth was momentarily taken aback as she saw a pickpocket running towards them. Elizabeth looked at the princess with alarm, but the note covered her with her body. The young man, in turn, shouted at the young girls to get out of the way. But a moment later, the young princess used her magic, and at that very moment, the pickpocket was floating in the air. She looked at the young man with cold fury. He was taken aback because at that very moment, he was tied up. Alicia caught his stolen trophy with a satisfied smile. A moment later, she handed the contents to the young lady. The young lady, in turn, thanked the princess with a smile for her help. Elizabeth smiled and said that they were very lucky to have the princess nearby. A moment later, Alicia looked closely at her friend and said that the beta had moved forward a little. Elizabeth was alarmed and asked if something was wrong. Alicia smiled and said that they would go to the police station and hand the young man over to them. A moment later, the young man fell to the ground with a thud and screamed. The princess said with a grin that they would simply make sure that the young people did their job well. That same evening, the emperor shared a meal with his daughter. He sighed heavily, and she looked at him intently. The emperor, without looking up at his daughter, said that he had heard that there was a commotion in the central square. The young princess casually said that that was exactly what had happened, but nothing special had happened. He sighed heavily and asked how long she would go out without an escort. Without looking at her father, She asked if he really thought she needed an escort knight. The emperor sighed heavily, but said nothing. A moment later, the emperor asked his daughter if it was true that she had fired the baron from the security department. To describe the situation in a few words, the baron told the young princess that he had committed a mortal sin, but still asked her to forgive him. She smiled and said that he should just die. She could not have imagined that the baron would pocket the money that they allocated for the country's security. She knew that he could not be killed, but he could be fired. She looked at her father closely and asked if there was something wrong with him. She wanted to know if, as a princess, she couldn't act alone when she fired him. He sighed heavily and said that it was not so. He looked at his daughter and said that if she had decided so, then there was a reason for it. Alicia looked at her father and said that she had heard that an envoy from the West would arrive in a few days. She asked if this was all happening on the eve of the emperor's birthday. Robertus said that everything was correct, and he would come to the birthday banquet. She looked at him intently and asked if he was sure about it. Robertus said that he was sure, and now was the right time to receive delegations from the Western Empire. She sighed heavily, as she was glad that she had bought a gift after all. The emperor said that among the delegations would be the crown prince of the Western Empire. The knight looked closely at his master and said with a smile that he seemed to be in a good mood. He asked if the prince was expecting anything special. He smiled and said that he was looking forward to meeting her. The young man looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not understand who he was talking about. But a moment later, the prince smiled and said that he really hoped they would arrive at their destination soon. Some time later, the young princess entered the room and froze for a moment. She looked at Isabella in surprise and asked what she was doing. Isabella smiled and told the princess that she was just making her bed. The princess said that this was the work of other servants, and she had no need to do it. She asked her nanny to leave such concerns because they just had more subordinates. Isabella smiled a soft smile as she looked at the princess and said that she knew that. But before, she not only cleaned the princess's bedroom, she also helped her with her preparations and walks. Alicia looked at her nanny with a gentle smile, but a moment later, she asked her nanny if she wanted to find a husband. Isabella was confused by such a question. She asked the princess where she would find a husband at her age. The princess smiled and said that she would definitely find a man in herself who would be by her side. She also said that it hurt her to see how she cared only for her. Isabella said that times were hard back then, and she shouldn't say things like that. Isabella looked at her mistress and said that she was in her prime for marriage, unlike her. She asked the princess if there was her one and only somewhere. The princess sighed heavily and said that there was no such thing. Isabella asked the princess what book she was reading. The princess said that she had recently learned that a delegation from the Western Empire would be arriving with the prince, so she had been studying the materials in advance. She studied all the information about the Western Empire and the crown prince, a prince born from the concubine of Hadrian Arland. The prince's childhood was not a bed of roses, but at the age of 10, he was able to beat his brothers in the entrance exams for the position, and proudly accepted the status of crown prince. The young lady studied the information closely, as she knew that he had a very interesting story. Alicia looked into the distance with a smirk as she eagerly awaited his arrival. Sometime later, the emperor and his daughter met the delegation. A moment later, they were informed that an ambassador from the Western Empire had arrived. Alicia looked closely at the young man, as she saw his blue hair and gray eyes. She understood that he did not look like the emperor of the Western Empire at all. She froze for a moment, looking at the young man, as he looked at her with a soft gaze and a sweet smile. The emperor, in turn, looked askance at his daughter, as he did not like the look of the young man. The young man bowed and introduced himself, telling everyone that he was the crown prince of the Western Empire. The emperor greeted the young prince and said that he had come a long way. Hadrian smiled and said that he had come with small gifts from the Western Empire, and he hoped that the emperor would accept them. The emperor thanked the young prince and also informed him that they had prepared a separate VIP room for the bones from the Western Empire. He asked them to rest a little from the journey and that they would continue their conversations in the evening. Adrian smiled and thanked the emperor for his concern. A moment later, the young prince looked at them intently and said that he had come from the Western Empire with a proposal for the empire. The emperor looked warily at the young man and asked what proposal he had come to them with. A moment later, the young prince looked at the young princess and addressed her. She looked at him in bewilderment. He smiled and said that he really hoped that she would go to a Western academy. The emperor was taken aback and shouted that she was not going anywhere. Alicia looked at the young man in surprise and asked why she needed to go there. A moment later, the ministers were shouting that this was a wonderful opportunity for exchange between the empires. Since over a long period of time, they had not established good communication with the empire. They said that the Western Empire Academy boasted of its level of knowledge. They told the princess that she could learn a lot. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't funny, and she didn't need to go there at all. The Duke looked closely at the young princess and asked, "How about Togo taking the test?" The Duke looked at the princess and said that the Western Empire had offered this out of flattery. He asked the princess if this exchange was profitable. He looked at her closely and said that many years ago he had asked her to prove her powers. He asked, "How about evaluating them now?" For a moment there was dead silence in the room. The young princess looked at everyone present with a fierce grin and mockery and said that she was not going anywhere and this issue was not up for discussion. They froze in place in shock as they did not expect such a thing. The emperor looked intently at everyone present and said that there was still time before the delegation from the Western Empire returned. He looked at his daughter intently and said that if she changed her mind, then they would give the delegation an answer. Some time later, the princess was enjoying a banquet, sipping champagne. She was taken aback when a young man approached her and, smiling, invited her to dance. She smiled and thanked the young man for the offer, but said that she had twisted her ankle today and therefore would not be able to dance with him. He sighed heavily and said that there was nothing he could do about it. She smiled and thanked him for his understanding. A moment later, he bowed and left. Devian looked closely at the princess and called her. He looked at the princess with excitement and asked which ankle he was talking about. She sighed heavily and told him not to find fault with her words, because she couldn't come up with any other excuse anyway. Devian began that the problem was not her excuse at all. He did not understand how long she would use him as her partner. She sighed heavily and said that he was still young, so he was suitable as a partner. He was shocked and called her, but she ran away from him with the speed of lightning. She sighed heavily as she did not consider anyone as a husband at all. A moment later, she met the prince, and he greeted her with a smile. He smiled and asked if she was having a good time. She was taken aback for a moment and said that she was having a very good time. But a moment later, she asked for forgiveness, as she wanted to step away for a minute. The prince called the princess in a hurry, and she stopped. He looked at her intently and asked if she didn't remember him. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Adrian Arland, born from a concubine I was once a servant to. He was a child who was not at all like the emperor. An unfortunate prince, a disgrace to the imperial family, a boy who was bullied even by his older brothers. But despite the resistance of many people, he was nominated as a candidate for the title of Crown Prince. And the conditions for achieving the title were several, but the most important thing was that the candidates had to bring what would best emphasize their imperial spirit in order to save his mother, who was exiled to a villa like a prison. The boy, with full determination, began the struggle for the throne. Many years ago, he visited a small but dangerous lake. He was shocked because he understood that this was all wrong, because of some octopus, he would not achieve anything. He understood that if he did something without thinking, the octopus would hit him with its tentacles, and he would die. He was furious because he had to take the Crown Prince exam. He knew that if he didn't bring anything, he would start laughing again. And not only those who opposed his candidacy for the title of Crown Prince would laugh. He sighed heavily, as he understood that he was truly not capable of the creature. But a moment later, the young man was taken aback, as he saw something in the distance. He froze in shock when he saw the young lady who easily dealt with the octopus. He saw her bright smile as she happily dealt with the octopus. He was shocked when she said that he could take it from the octopus for himself. Then his benefactress said that he should not go near the lake because she did not know how long the kraken was still hiding at the bottom of the lake. He froze and watched intently as she disappeared. But now he stopped the princess because he knew that they had met before and she had saved him. He looked at her with confusion and asked if she didn't remember him, but the princess only looked at him with bewilderment. Adrian looked at the princess intently, as he expected her to answer something. She looked at him in bewilderment, since she didn't particularly remember their meeting. But a moment later, the young man called the prince. The prince looked at the baron in surprise, as he did not expect to see him. The baron bowed and greeted the princess and said that he was accompanying the delegation of the Western Empire. She looked at him in surprise and greeted him back with a smile. The baron informed the crown prince that someone was looking for him. The crown prince bowed and told the princess that they would see each other later. Alicia looked at him in surprise and wished him a good time. In turn, the princess looked intently after the crown prince, and the baron noticed this. A moment later, the defense looked at the young princess and asked if she would like to make a gift for the emperor. The lady was taken aback because it had completely slipped her mind. She smiled and said that she was a little embarrassed, so she would give the gift to her father after the banquet. He looked at her in surprise and, sighing heavily, said that it was very unfortunate. A moment later, he asked the young princess if she was interested in what gift the prince had given the emperor. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He asked if she had not heard. He said with delight that the crown prince had given the emperor a beautiful sword, and on the emperor's birthday he had prepared for his majesty a beautiful wolf that he had caught himself. She sighed heavily and said with a smile that she understood everything. She understood that there was no point in him bragging about the crown prince. A moment later, the baron said mockingly that since she was a woman, it would be difficult for her to do something like that. Alicia's expression changed, and a moment later she said with a smile that there seemed to be no better gift than wolf fur. He said with a smile that everything was correct. A moment later, the princess said that since she had thought about the gift, it was time to show it. She looked at the baron intently and with a grin said that he should forgive her because she would only be gone for a minute. A moment later, she used her magic and disappeared without a trace with the speed of lightning. The baron was shocked. He looked around in surprise, as she had indeed disappeared. A moment later, the crown prince approached the baron and asked if the princess would return. The baron was shocked and shouted to the crown prince that the princess had suddenly disappeared. And she had not just disappeared, but had teleported away. The crown prince looked at him in bewilderment. But a moment later, they looked away as they heard a terrible roar. A few seconds later, they clearly saw in front of them the princess, who brought with her a huge wolf. Everyone present was in shock. They didn't understand what was going on at all. They were shocked because they saw a dead wolf in the middle of the hall. The princess looked at the baron with a grin and asked how he liked such a gift. Alicia looked at him intently and said that since she had decided to give the wolf, it would be more than anything. The baron froze in shock and trembled in fear. The crown prince looked at the man in bewilderment, as he did not understand what had happened between them. She looked at the man with mockery as he dared to challenge her. Sometime later, the crown prince apologized on behalf of the baron. She sighed heavily and said that he could forget about it, since it was not his fault. A moment later, the crown prince asked the princess with a smile why she refused to visit the Western Empire. He smiled and said that he would like the princess to visit the Western Empire. She looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding why he wanted this so passionately. He smiled a radiant smile and told the princess that he liked her and that he had liked her for a long time. Alicia froze for a moment in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked away from him and asked if he really liked her from the first meeting. He said with a smile that everything was correct, because their meeting was many years ago. Adrian said with a smile that it was okay if she didn't remember, because he remembered everything. Alicia froze in place for a moment in surprise, as she did not expect this. Kashan looked at the princess intently and asked where she was going. She sighed heavily and said that she wanted to go to the Western Empire, and also asked her friend if he wanted to go with her. Kashan surprised the princess and asked why he should do this. The princess said that they would go together to the academy to study, because he himself used to start crying to her that he was dying of boredom. Kashan looked at the princess in surprise and asked why she had to go there. He asked if she had thought that the emperor might die. Alicia sighed heavily and said that she was just curious about something. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Alicia said she was curious about the crown prince of the Western Empire. She sighed heavily and looked intently into the distance. Kashan looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what exactly she was curious about. She sighed heavily and said that he told her that he had fallen in love with her on their first meeting. Kashan sighed heavily and said that he was disgusted to hear such a thing. As a result, the young man got hit on the head by the princess after his words. Sometime later, the young people said goodbye to the delegation from the Western Empire. Sedelt looked closely at the prince and wished them all a safe journey. Sedelt said that His Majesty expressed his regret that he could not come in person due to urgent state affairs. The Crown Prince smiled and said that it was okay, since it was state affairs, and he could not do anything. The princess was furious, as she knew that this was just an excuse, and that her father was probably just sitting in his office looking through papers. A moment later, the Crown Prince approached the young princess and called out to her with a smile. She smiled and said that he should return unharmed. She sighed heavily and wondered if this was too much of a game on her part. But a moment later, the Crown Prince tenderly took her hand and looked at the princess with a gentle smile. She froze in surprise, as no one had ever allowed themselves to do something like this to her before. She was surprised when he kissed her hand tenderly. He looked at the young princess with a gentle smile and said that until their next meeting, she should be safe. The princess froze in surprise for a moment and was speechless. At the same time, the emperor was sitting in his office and closely studying the documents. He was reading a petition for admission to the Imperial Academy. A moment later, he was taken aback as his daughter appeared in front of him using magic. Without looking up from the documents, the emperor asked if something had happened. Alicia looked at her father intently and said that since he had not said anything even when the delegation was leaving, she had decided to come to him first. Robertus sighed heavily and said that he had already received a report about the delegation from the Western Empire from his subordinate. He looked at her intently and said that they thought there was something she should report to him personally. She realized that he had already decided that she would not go to the academy. A moment later, the young princess confidently told her father that she would be entering the Western Empire Academy. Robertus, in turn, said that if she made this decision only because of the ministers, then she shouldn't do it. Looking at his daughter, he said that even if they hadn't conducted an exchange with the Western Empire for a long time, it didn't mean that problems would arise immediately. She looked at her father intently and said it wasn't because of that. She said that she would enter the academy because she decided to do so herself. The emperor froze for a moment and looked at his daughter in surprise. A moment later, he said that he understood her and also asked if she would have any regrets about this choice. She sighed heavily and said that she would have no regrets. Alicia looked closely at her father and said that in this document that he was now reviewing, he must put his seal and his approval. Alicia smiled and said that he should do it before she lost interest in the Western Empire. Robertus, looking up from the documents, asked if the Crown Prince was one of her reasons for the decision. She looked at him in surprise, since she did not understand what he was talking about, but he sighed heavily and said that she should not take his words to heart. Sometime later, she looked at all her friends with a joyful smile and said that she was leaving, while Kashan, with the help of magic, took on an appearance that matched his friend. The mages sighed heavily and looked at the young princess with puzzlement. They asked her not to leave and not to leave them alone, since they would have to continue their research without her from now on. She sighed heavily and said that they should not exaggerate, since she was only leaving for 1 year, and it was not that long. Davian looked at the young princess with a gentle smile and wished her a safe journey. She smiled at the young man and said that he had better do his part, and she would check all the data upon her return. He looked at her with a smile, as she was, as always, full of energy. A moment later, the young princess looked at Isabella and called her. Alicia said about her nanny that she would write to her often, but not every day. Isabella looked at the princess worriedly and asked her to take care of herself first. She asked the princess not to skip meals. Alicia smiled and told her nanny that she should not worry about such things. Alicia looked at her nanny with a smile and said that she also had to take care of herself, and just because she wasn't there didn't mean she had to eat badly and sleep badly. The princess asked her nanny not to be lonely or sad. Kashan looked at his friend with a puzzled expression and said that she had already said enough. A moment later, he used his magic and the princess disappeared in that same hour. Isabella was shocked, as she did not expect this. A moment later, they arrived at the Academy of the Western Kingdom. The young princess was yelling at her friend as she was in the middle of an important conversation with Isabella. Everyone was looking at the young people in surprise and intently. She was furious because she didn't understand who ordered him to teleport them. The young man was in shock. He screamed and asked her to let go of his head because it hurt him. The maids were taken aback and sighed heavily and told the princess that everyone was watching them. A moment later, the princess sighed heavily and told her friend that just for the sake of the maids, she would leave him alone. He said that she could just teleport them away and avoid all the drama. A moment later, the maid approached the young lord and called him. He looked at her in bewilderment. She looked at him closely and attentively and said that it was time to go to the entrance exam, so she presented him with a small bag. He looked at the maid in surprise and asked if he was the only one who had to go to the exam. He did not understand why the princess should not go with him. The young princess said with a satisfied grin that the royal side of the Western Empire had already completed the registration process for her. He sighed heavily and looked at her intently, as she was simply bragging in front of him. But a moment later, the young man rose up in confusion and sighed heavily. He took his bag and went to take the exam. But all this irritated him terribly. In turn, Alicia looked after him with a mocking expression on her face. But a moment later, she turned around because she heard someone calling her. A moment later, she saw a strange man running towards her at full speed with a beaming smile. The man introduced himself with his joyful smile and said that he was entrusted with accompanying the star of the Eastern Empire. She sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, and also said that she was pleased to meet him. Mushu sighed heavily and said that they were waiting for her at the port, but upon hearing that she had arrived at the academy, he immediately ran to her. He offered his deepest apologies for being late. Alicia smiled and said that it was okay. He didn't need to apologize. She was well aware that it was her friend's fault, since he teleported carelessly. Mushu looked at the young princess and said that he would first take her to the hotel. A moment later, a young lady suddenly approached them. She smiled and asked Mushu what he was doing here. The man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what brought her to them. She smiled and said that many things were needed before the new students arrived. But a moment later, the young lady casually asked the man who this person was. Alicia, in turn, looked at the young lady in bewilderment as her tone was very casual. Mushu smiled and asked the princess for forgiveness and introduced her to the young lady, the daughter of one of the 3 count families of the Western Empire, the House of Belleria. Mushu also introduced the young princess to the young lady. The young lady casually said that it seemed like the princess was the one who was supposed to be her junior. The young lady looked at the princess with a fierce grin and a fake smile. Alicia, in turn, looked at the young lady with bewilderment, as she did not understand what had happened at all. The young lady smiled and said that she was late in her congratulations. She bowed with a smile and said that it was an honor for her to meet the star of the Eastern Empire, Erica Bellaria of the Bellaria Duke's House of the Western Empire. Alicia smiled a fake smile and said, "Young lady, it was a pleasure to meet her." Erica smiled as she looked at the princess and said that she had heard earlier that she had transferred mid-semester, and it was a great honor to meet her. Alicia looked at the young lady with a smile and thanked her for her warm welcome, and said that the young lady learned the news very quickly. Erica smiled and said that she heard that His Highness the Crown Prince personally went to the Eastern Empire to escort the young princess to them. Erica, with a satisfied smile, told the princess that, for the record, she was also a third-year student, just like His Highness. She looked at the princess intently and said with a stern look that she was the closest to the Crown Prince in the academy. Alicia sighed heavily, as she had no intention of asking such a question. Erica looked at the princess intently and said that if she encountered any difficulties while getting by in their empire, she should not hesitate to contact her. Erica smiled and said that if the princess needed any urgent help, she would be happy to provide it to her. The princess, in turn, looked closely at the young lady, but did not answer. For a while, they just looked at each other in silence, but the atmosphere between them was tense. The young princess yawned, sighed heavily. She was very sleepy, and it seemed to her that she might die while she waited for the whole celebration to end. The young man looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they would now present an award to the best student. He said with a smile that their best student was Kashan, while the princess continued to sit and eat, wondering what was happening. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in shock when she saw her friend who was about to receive an award as the best student. All the girls present were delighted with the young man. They did not understand why he was so irresistible. They said that his face was the most beautiful in the academy, and he was also the best student in the academy. A moment later, the professor presented the young man with an award for the best results in the academy. Alicia sighed heavily, as she knew that the young man was very good. A moment later, all students were informed that there was an announcement for new students. New students were asked to check the list at the entrance to the hall. They were asked to go to their dorm after checking the list, and were also informed that their roommate would not change for the entire 3 years. A moment later, the young princess and her friend were slowly walking towards the dormitory. Alicia looked at her friend closely and asked if he was happy now. He smiled contentedly and said that in order to build good relationships with people, things like this are needed. He said with a satisfied smile that she, of course, did not know this, because he was her only friend. She looked at him in surprise and said with bewilderment that she had nothing like that. The young man froze in place from shock. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand his reaction. Kashan asked with bewilderment, "How was he?" The princess turned around and, leaving, sighed heavily and said that he was just an appendage. The young man was in shock, as her words wounded him right in the heart and pierced him through and through. A moment later, the young princess came to a new room. She slowly opened the door and looked into the room, as she wanted to remember what her neighbor's name was. A moment later, she saw a young lady leisurely making her bed. The young lady turned around and was taken aback as she saw the princess in front of her. With lightning speed, she bowed to the princess and greeted her, and also said that her name was Isabella. The princess looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and extended her hand to her, and she also said that she was pleased to meet her. Isabella stood frozen for a moment in surprise and embarrassment, as the princess was truly beautiful with her radiant smile. A moment later, the princess asked her new neighbor if she could choose a specific bed. Isabella smiled and told the princess that she could choose any bed she liked. A moment later, Isabella began to unpack her things. The princess looked intently at her neighbor and called her. Isabella was taken aback. Alicia looked at the young lady closely and asked what house she was in. Isabella was a little surprised, but a moment later, she said that she was currently in the fencing house. Alicia smiled tenderly at the young lady and said that it suited her. Isabella sighed heavily and sadly asked the princess if she really thought so. Isabella sighed heavily and said that others said it wasn't right for her. The princess looked closely at her friend and wondered if everyone thought she wasn't suited to this direction because of her appearance. Alicia looked closely at her new friend and with a gentle smile said that this was not true, and fencing suited her better than anyone else. She asked her new friend to be confident in herself and not to look at anyone. The young lady froze for a moment, as she was shocked by the princess's words. The young lady thanked the princess, but also said that she wanted to tell her something. The princess looked at the girl in bewilderment. She did not understand them. She wanted to talk to her about something. Isabella smiled and asked the princess if she would mind calling her Bet for short. The princess smiled and said that of course she would call her that if it was convenient for her. At this, the princess beamed and called her by her abbreviated name, and the young lady melted, looking at the princess. Sometime later, the young people went to dinner. The man looked at the girls with a smirk and said that the new students were very hot and cute. The young lady heard that the crown prince was very handsome, so she came to the cafeteria to look at him. But she was furious because she didn't understand why she had to deal with such losers. She knew they were just nasty and scary. The man came closer to her and asked with a nasty grin if she really wanted to eat and have dessert with them. He said with a grin that there was a place in the academy that only they knew about. She was shocked and asked them to leave her alone, but all her attempts were unsuccessful. So after a couple of seconds, she grabbed a glass of water and splashed it in the man's face, as she could no longer tolerate such treatment. They were scary, but she still decided to do it. But a moment later, she froze in place. The man, in turn, was furious. He did not expect anything like this from the young lady. A moment later, he raised his hand over her, as if he wanted to strike. But a moment later, the man was taken aback and froze in place in surprise, as someone stopped his hand. At the same time, the young princess pulled the man and slammed him into the ground with fury. He made a long sound, but nothing more. Everyone present was shocked by what they saw. The young man rushed to his friend, as if to know in order or that. At the same time, The young lady froze in admiration, looking at the princess. The princess sighed heavily and, looking at the man, said that it looked like he was passed out. The crown prince looked at us and his colleagues intently and with a smile, thanked everyone for their hard work. The young lady walked up to the crown prince, smiling and saying that she had finished preparing the materials he had asked for earlier for the freshmen's welcoming party. He smiled and thanked her for her good work. He looked at the young lady with a smile and thanked her for helping him at all. She smiled sheepishly and said that wherever the president was, and she, as vice president, should always remain close to him, and that was natural. He smiled and asked if it was time for them to finish, as it was already quite late. She smiled and agreed with him. She looked after him closely a moment later, as she noticed that the atmosphere was conducive to a good start, so she wondered if she could invite him to have dinner together now. Erica looked at the prince with a happy smile and asked if he had time, as she would like to have dinner with him. A moment later, she looked at him in surprise as he stared out the window with a gentle smile. The young lady was a little surprised and at the same time puzzled, as she didn't know what he was looking at so intently. But looking out the window, she noticed the princess.